His voice turned high and crackly. "That's not why I didn't want to talk to you. I don't know anything about that." "Then why?" "You're only interested in Emily's murder." "Yes." "Because if I tell you about Emily and me, well, some of the things we did in those days weren't legal. We thought we were doing the right thing at the time and that the laws were wrong. I don't want any of this coming back at me." "Mr. Shorter, when was the last time you saw Emily?" Shorter seemed to sag, the question hitting him like a punch to the guts. "About 8 months ago," he said in a flat, distant voice. "She decided we were over, packed up her stuff and left." "And you haven't heard from her since?" "Not a word." Geneva thought about the timing of this. 8 months ago. Did she leave out of the blue, or were you going through a difficult time? Shorter laughed unexpectedly, a small, dry, strangled choke of air. "Difficult? With Emily, everything was difficult." He picked up an oversized paperclip and started kneading it between his fingers. "She was different when we first met, of course. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe it was me who was different back then." He put down the unfolded paperclip, pulled open a drawer, and took out a pack of cigarettes, an ashtray, and a lighter. "You see, we didn't meet like a normal couple does," Shorter explained, coughing on the smoke of the cigarette as he tried to light it. "We didn't hook up at the uni bop or in smoky pubs or at lectures. When I first saw Emily, she was wearing a black balaclava, a vinyl jumpsuit, and she was covered in horse's blood." Shorter let out a bitter little laugh. "I guess you could say it was love at first sight." "Where was this?" Geneva inquired, feeling the slightest twinge of... what? She couldn't quite name it. Some pale and minor envy at the lingering devotions in other people's lives, perhaps. "We were on a Hunsab mission. This was the late 90s, early 2000s. Students marching against the poll tax, against fees, against foreign intervention. It was an exciting time. The world was changing, and we believed we were the instruments of that change." Shorter took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "That day, when I got out of the van, I saw her. I actually stopped in my tracks, unprepared for such a vision. She was standing under a tree pouring ball bearings from a cardboard box into small sandwich bags." "Ball bearings?" Geneva asked. "We'd leave them dotted around the route of the hunt, and when the horse's hooves made contact, the bags would burst, spilling their contents. Once the first horse goes down, it's like dominoes." "I guess you weren't too concerned about the horses' rights, or did you see them as collaborators?" Shorter shot Geneva a sharp glance, not quite sure if she was asking him a question or making a statement. She noted a faint flaring in his eyes, a rush of blood to the cheeks, as if something had come to the surface and been instantly snuffed out. I know, he admitted. "It's funny how easily you can convince yourself of the necessity of violence when you're fighting to obliterate it." He shook his head. "We shared the same van on the way back. It had been a successful sab, but a costly one. The riders had attacked us with whips and clubs, but that just made the atmosphere on the ride back even more electric. The van was everything." Shorter's eyes glowed with sparks of resurfaced memory, his whole body shuddering into animation as he continued, and Geneva could tell this was a part of himself and his past he romanticised and used as a bulwark against his fading present. "You have to understand that. When we were in the van, the constant hum of the world disappeared. We no longer worried about the essay we were due to hand in, the girl who may or may not call back, the raging slam-door argument with parents. None of that mattered. In the van, there was just us and the task at hand. There was only now, the next hunt, the next bend of the road, the next police stop. Names were not important. History and background were not important. We lived in the van that summer. We slept and talked and cooked and fucked and argued in the van. We knew every rivet and dent and bump, and where to sleep without waking up bruised and cramped, and where to hide our stashes when we got pulled over. We crisscrossed the country that summer up and down motorways and rural 2 lanes. We went to marches and protests and sit-ins, wildcat strikes in medieval stone villages and anti-war rallies in the heart of the capital. There was always somewhere to go to, new drugs to take, the clamour of massed voices, the tingled anticipation of trouble, the blood rush of the cause. There were 5 of us in the van, but really there was only Emily and me. That doesn't sound to me like someone who would spend their time in a convent. A convent? Shorter's eyes rattled in confusion. He picked up another paperclip and was pulling it apart between his fingers. I couldn't think of a less likely place for Emily. How about nuns? Did Emily ever mention being involved with nuns? Nuns? Shorter shook his head. He caught his thumb on the point of the paperclip, winced as a bright red dot bloomed from his skin. What else was Emily involved in? What do you got? Shorter said in a weird accent. Carrigan looked up from his notes. Like Brando in The Wild One? Shorter explained. It's how I always used to think of Emily back then. Didn't matter what the cause was, she would throw herself headlong into it. It's partly what made her so attractive, that unswerving dedication and wild-eyed zeal. She wasn't like the rest of them. You have to understand that. For her, it wasn't a posture, a way to make her life seem more meaningful than it really was. She actually meant it too much. That was the problem. She became so consumed by the troubles of the rest of the world, and so enmeshed in its grievances, that she somehow lost herself. And it wasn't long before I discovered another Emily residing just below the surface. Another Emily? Geneva said, seeing flashes of pain settle in Shorter's eyes. I began to see that there were 2 Emilys. There was the Emily I'd met, the midnight warrior dressed all in black, ready to go out any time of day or night and right injustice, who came back from meetings flushed and excited, who couldn't get the words out fast enough, who sat on the couch and brilliantly analysed and dissected the problems of the world. And then there was the other Emily. The days and weeks when things quietened, when even the most strident of activists had to go to the library, put their heads down and revise for finals. This was the Emily who stayed in bed all day with the curtains closed, who spent hours telling me over and over how much she detested her parents, who locked herself in the bathroom for hours at a time, who looked in the mirror and saw only saggy skin, an ugly nose, bitten nails and fat legs. I took her to Florence, to Amsterdam and New York. I wanted her to see some of the other side of life, to let her hair down. But wherever we went, she would just sit there and simmer, finding injustice in the smallest thing. But you still moved down to London together? Geneva asked. I thought that once away from the buzz of student life, she'd get better, realised the world was much bigger and more complex than she painted it. But London only made Emily worse. She no longer had the constant rush of meetings and seminars to go to. She was now in the real world, and the real world came crashing up against her. She hardened in turn, became less communicative, except when railing against something or other she'd read on the internet. Those were not good times. We argued all hours, furiously, with our words and with our hands at the top of our voices. She'd call me a stooge, a collaborator, a capitalist pig. She spent entire evenings putting my family on trial. She would storm out, lose herself in the London night, be gone for days at a time, and come back with a strange vacancy in her eyes and a small offering, a cake she knew I liked, or a paperback, or a bottle of wine, for the worry she'd caused me. Do you have any idea where she went? Shorter poured himself a fresh drink. No, but she found what she was looking for in London. Meetings and action groups, angry young men and women whose lives had left them with nothing but hate. We stopped sleeping together. We stopped talking to each other. We set up a couch in the living room, and on the nights Emily did return, she would sleep there. She began hanging out in the squats of East London, these Dickensian hellholes. No water, no electricity, rats and food left rotting for days. These people wanted to save the world, but they couldn't even keep their own house in order. They pretended that cleanliness was a bourgeois concept, that washing and changing clothes were just another surrender to the system. Shorter lit a cigarette and blew the smoke at the ceiling. She began to get more secretive. She disappeared for days at a time, often coming back bruised and bloody, her eyes burning fiercely. Shorter paused, took a deep breath, and his eyes drew hard and tight. And then Nigel entered the picture. Nigel? Geneva looked up from her notes, catching the shift in Shorter's tone. He called himself Nigel the Nail. He used to say he didn't want to be a thorn in the side of the government, but a great big fucking nail. That tells you as much as you need to know about how Nigel saw himself. He was the self-appointed guru of the squat set, older by a generation, regaling them with stories of manning the barricades during the strikes of the Thatcher years, his time in prison, his days in Belfast and the West Bank. Emily had been so uncommunicative for so long, and suddenly she was talking all the time about Nigel and how he did this and did that, and it was obvious she'd fallen in love with him. A month or two after she met him, she told me it was over. Nigel came to help her pack her things, to make sure I didn't cause a scene, she said. As if I even cared enough by that point. Nigel stood there, sneering and making remarks about my furniture, my accent, the kind of coffee I had in the cupboard. Emily took her clothes and very little else. That was the last time I saw her. Shorter sat back in his chair and stared vacantly at the wall, slumped and drained. It's easy to see now she was in a downward spiral. But at the time you always think this will pass, that things will get better. But they never do. And every day you become a little less blind, and it freezes your heart to look at the only person you've ever loved and see no future at all in their eyes. There was nothing to say to this. They thanked him and left him there, his face white and his Christmas ruined. As soon as Geneva was back in the car, she immediately began typing into the onboard computer. Carrigan waited, the screen angled away from him, so that he couldn't tell what she was looking at. Instead, he watched her face, as it changed from worry and frown to a quick, delicious smile. What is it? Nigel the Nail's got some previous. Carrigan nodded and started the car. From what Shorter told us about him, that doesn't surprise me in the least. Well, Geneva said, drawing it out, does it surprise you that 4 of those charges were for arson? Chapter 33. Nigel Burton, a.k.a. Nigel the Nail, had been remarkably easy to find.
Amazed you didn't see him on telly last week,
a gruff sergeant from the public order unit had explained.
He's marshalling one of those anti-Tesco protests. Loves the camera, our Nigel does. Loves getting arrested too. Good for his image and all that.
Carrigan let Geneva do the driving so he could study Nigel's file on the way over. He didn't even notice Geneva's music or the spiralling South London snow, his eyes and thoughts completely ensnared by Nigel's arrest sheet. He'd been in trouble since the age of 15. Burton, or Nigel the Nail, as he was now legally known after a deed poll change, had been arrested 17 times. He'd spent a total of 38 months in various low-level prisons, and each time he was released, he wasted no time before re-offending. Nigel's first arrests were nothing unusual. Possession of Class B drugs, a minor infraction in a pub at closing time, the charges later dropped. But then he had got serious, and most subsequent arrests were for public disorder issues, mainly stemming from his participation in violent protests and riots. However, what Carrigan was most interested in were the 4 counts of arson Nigel had been charged with. 2 Starbucks, a suburban branch of Nat West, and a synagogue. None of the charges had been proven, witnesses had backed out, evidence got misplaced, and Nigel always had a crew of cohorts on hand to provide him with a timely alibi. According to the sheet, Nigel was now living in a squat in Balham and leading the protest at the new Tesco Express. Carrigan looked down at the printouts, confused, feeling a slight judder of disorientation. His mind reeled back through the last few days. They'd been digging deep into the convent's secret history. They'd been following up the drugs in the neighbourhood angle. They'd been tracking the Peruvian connection. He didn't know where or how Nigel fitted in, but his form for arson and his relationship with the 11th victim changed everything. They turned into a narrow high street, and Geneva pulled the car to a stop outside a row of cracked and leaning terraces. A huge, hand-daubed banner was spread along the facade of 3 of the houses. Red paint read, "Tesco brings Nazism to your street," and "Smash the supermarkets." The lettering was crude, and a misspelling had been painted over twice. Across the road, in the middle of a small parade of shops, was a Tesco Express, one window covered by a sheet of rough, splintered plywood. "Democracy in action," Carrigan said as he pulled on his jacket and headed for the squat's front door. Except there wasn't a front door. The council had removed it and replaced it with large grey Cytex screens. The screens had been pulled open and now stood flapping in the wind. Carrigan heard the dull thump of electronic music echoing from inside and could see the shadow dance of people flickering across the windows. "Ready for this?" he asked Geneva. "No," she replied, "but that never stopped me doing anything before." She smiled, and then her mouth curled up into a frown. "What?" "You look way too much like a copper," she said. "I don't know whether to take that as a compliment or not." She looked him up and down. "I know we're not exactly undercover, but it would help if we didn't immediately look like the enemy." She made him take off his jacket and put it back in the car. His tie was similarly disposed of. "Lucky you've got a beard," she said, shuffling closer to him, "but it's too neat." Before he could react, she leaned forward and ran her fingers through his beard, fluffing and messing it. Carrigan smiled, feeling he didn't quite know what, as they stepped through the Cytex screen and into a dark corridor reeking of weed and booze and body odour. Music was seeping from every corner of the house, several different tracks clashing and crashing in a dissonant caterwaul. He couldn't believe people lived like this, life reduced to the bare essentials, and often not even that. No water or electricity or heating. And yet, what were your options if you were young and starting out in London? The rent's so high that an entire segment of society was now kept off the property ladder. He looked around the crumbling corridor. The squatters had followed their own logic and beliefs. They didn't think it was morally just that buildings should be vacant, but they missed the bigger picture, and Carrigan thought back to last night's conversation. If every marginalised group took the law into their own hands, society wouldn't last very long. "You want to try in there?" Geneva shouted above the dull thump of drum and bass, nodding towards a door on their left. Carrigan went in first and was greeted by a thick fog of cannabis smoke. The room was shaking with the music, the walls convulsing and throbbing like beating ventricles. Sweat popped on his forehead and under his collar, the heat and music of 50 or 60 bodies dancing and swaying to the deep rhythmic pulse, the room itself seeming to breathe in time with the beat. They let their eyes and ears adjust and tried to spot anyone resembling Nigel, but it was impossible, and they left, their bodies still vibrating with the deep, rumbling bass drones. They passed through a dangerously leaning partition wall that had come loose and ducked through a hole into a large hallway. The walls were painted in bright, lurid colours, daubed with monosyllabic slogans and the ubiquitous anarchist sign. Carrigan heard something behind him and stopped. He thought he saw a flash of yellow hair, but when his eyes focused, there was nothing but the empty hallway. He turned and followed Geneva through the winding labyrinth, realizing they were in the house next door now, that all the houses were connected, and that the squatters had erected makeshift walls and corridors to guide them through. In the next room, people were slumped on sofas and beanbags, listening to music that seemed to consist of nothing but fire alarms, fax screeches, and klaxons calls. The occupants were passing around a large cylinder of gas between them. A face mask was connected to a white rubber tube, and each person took long, hungry pulls, their expressions distorted by the mask. Geneva went around asking if anyone knew Emily or had seen Nigel, but it was hard to tell if the people in the room even registered her or merely thought she was part of their shared hallucination. They left the room and realised that they were now lost, not sure how many of the connected houses they'd passed through. Carrigan felt his head swell with the roar and scream of the music and quickened his step, leading Geneva down a long, reeking hallway and into a dead end. "Christ!" he said, turning round, and that was when he saw the girl. She was blonde and small, her T-shirt dark against her flat torso. She had large green eyes and a slender neck that didn't look like it could support the weight of her head. She didn't say anything, but beckoned them with her hand, and, before they could stop her, she had turned away, and they had little choice but to follow. Through the darkness and muck, through corridors and barriers, through noise and heat and broken walls, until the girl ducked under a low-hanging beam and into a dark, cramped room. Carrigan went first, Geneva following, watching their back. "Close the door." They did as they were told, and stood in total darkness, every muscle and fibre of their bodies attuned and tense. "I'm sorry. I didn't want anyone to see me talking to you. I saw it on the news," the girl said, switching on a small electric light which radiated across her face, making her look like a gilded angel. "I'm not doing this for you," she made clear to them, her accent rough and common and slightly exaggerated, a distinct middle-class burr underneath. She looked all of 14, a slim nothing of a girl, long blonde hair matted and split, her face a mask of scary blankness. Another one of those girls, Geneva thought, who created a web of chaos around them, shiny black ravens in a hurricane. "I'm only doing this for Em." "You knew Emily?" Geneva asked. The girl nodded. "Yeah. We used to hang out a bit when she was staying here." "She lived here?" Geneva took a step forward and looked around, realising that this was the girl's bedroom, the hairdryer on the chair, the crumpled magazines and pillows and empty food cartons. "How long ago?" The girl sniffled and lit a cigarette, the smoke filling the room and shrouding her face. "She first turned up, I think it was February. She was one of Nigel's." "One of Nigel's?" The girl looked at Geneva, totally ignoring Carrigan. "You know, one of his girls. He always has a new one around, the ones he can mould, the ones that fall under his spell. He turned up with her one night, like showing off his new recruits, introduced her to everyone." The girl took quick, angry drags off her cigarette. "We started seeing her more and more, and one day she was crashing here, permanent-like, and before we knew it, she was doing all the talking and planning. Nigel found a right one when he found her." "What kind of stuff are we talking about?" The girl ground out her cigarette and glared at Geneva. "It's okay. We're not interested in anything but finding out who killed Emily." "You mean that?" she said, and when Geneva nodded, the girl seemed to accept it. "Nigel's part of what he likes to call the movement. He organises and mobilises people for protests, war, student fees, human rights violations, doesn't matter what." The girl's lips were thin and pinched, and it was hard to believe she was so young. Emily was just like him. She lived for the moment we hit the streets, came up against the cordons and looked into the eyes of the enemy. She was one of those people who only found themselves in the crowd, in the flash and roar of running battle. She was only ever happy when she was fighting. That's why Nigel loved her. She was his mirror in so many ways. Geneva lit a cigarette for herself, then another for the girl. "How long did she stay here for?" she asked, trying to get a sense of the timeline, the blank space between Emily leaving Jeff Shorter and the fire in the convent. "She was here 6 months, maybe a little less. Then they went abroad, her and Nigel, and when they came back she'd changed." "Abroad? Where?" Geneva tried to keep the excitement out of her voice, tried to tell herself this was probably nothing, just another step out of many that Emily had taken to get to the convent on that particular night. The girl looked down at the floor, or at her torn trainers, the toes poking out. It was hard to tell. "I think it was Nigel's idea. He'd come into some money. No idea where they went, but they were gone 3 weeks, and when they came back, Emily was different." "Different how?" Geneva and Carrigan looked at each other. "More focused? As if all her stray particles had finally come to rest. She began to miss meetings and marches, went out for days at a time, never telling anyone where she'd been. She started criticising Nigel and the things we were doing. He confronted her one night, both of them screaming at each other in the kitchen, Emily laying into him for not having enough commitment, for only being interested in causes that got him on TV. The next day she was gone. Left all her stuff and didn't bother telling anyone." "Her stuff?" Carrigan said. "Just left it here. I kept it in case she came back. But she never did." "Do you still have it?" The girl went over to a corner of the room. She reached behind a thin mattress that lay flush against the wall and pulled out a small canvas bag and handed it to Geneva. Geneva opened the flap and gazed down at the contents. There was a toothbrush and an electric razor, a couple of faded paperbacks, a stack of scratched CDRs, a few blurry photos, a packet of cigarettes, a lighter, and a black notebook. "We'd also really like to talk to Nigel." "So would I." The girl shrugged and scratched her wrist. Geneva saw that the skin was red and dry, striated with white crescents and old cutting scars. "He was supposed to be here for the protest party but never showed up. First I ever heard of Nigel missing a party." "How long has he been gone?" The girl thought about this, her lower lip pressed between her teeth. "I haven't seen him for 5 days. The news people were back yesterday. I'm surprised he missed that." 5 days. The day of the fire. "Did Nigel or Emily ever mention anything about nuns?" Carrigan asked. The girl looked at him as if he were mad. Geneva handed her a card, said to call if she remembered anything else, and thanked her. The girl whispered, "Good luck." But when they turned, she'd already disappeared back into the darkness. When they made it back through the connected rooms and corridors to the main hallway, they saw them. 2 men stood against the front door, blocking their path. They were young but heavily muscled, one with a green Mohican, the other shaved except for one black lock, gelled and twisted around his neck in the shape of a noose. They both wore torn T-shirts, snarls, and old scars across their faces. Carrigan instinctively moved closer to Geneva. He looked at the door, then he looked at the men. Mohican was reaching into his pocket. Noose extended his arm across the door in a challenge. Carrigan could see Geneva gripping the bag with Emily's things tightly in one hand, the other resting on her hip. He glanced behind him and saw that others had left the party and were gathering to watch the action. A group of men and a couple of women stood a few feet away, swigging cider, laughing and blocking their escape. Carrigan quickly ran through their options. He knew they'd been stupid in coming here alone, but he'd also known that coming in with a full team would have ruined whatever chance they'd had at finding anything. He felt his body tensing, his hand reaching down for the snapstick he wore on his belt.
"Come on, then,"
Mohican snarled.
"I can't wait to fucking have you."
Carrigan saw him smile, then pull something from his back pocket. It took him a few seconds to realise it was a chunky black padlock. It was tied to a long rope, and the man began to swing it in front of him in long, extended arcs. Carrigan heard Geneva breathing heavily beside him, the rumble of her fear, the tightness in his own throat.
"Step away from the door now."
The two punks laughed, and Mohican swung the padlock and, just as quickly, snapped it back. When Geneva flinched, he burst out laughing.
"You cunts," he said. "Think you can just come in here and there'll be no consequences?"
Carrigan glanced down at Geneva, saw her face reddening, her hands twitching at her sides. She tightened her grip on Emily's bag. Carrigan looked behind him, noticing that the crowd was becoming more animated and that there would be no way out in that direction. The two punks and the door were their only option. He was trying to decide the best course of action when Geneva launched herself at Mohican. The man swung with the padlock as she entered his space. Carrigan saw her duck, missing the ridged metal by only a few inches, then swing upwards with her baton, smashing it hard into Mohican's crotch as the padlock crashed into the wall. Carrigan was already moving on the other man, using the full weight of his body to force him back. A sharp, stinging pain burned through his ear as the man's jaw clamped shut over it. Carrigan felt something rip, turned to see Noose grinning with bloody lips, and smashed his truncheon into the man's stomach. Noose went down without a sound, and Carrigan placed his shoe on the man's neck, pinning him to the floor. He could see some of the others starting to creep up on them, not sure whether to join the fight or just watch, and then all he could see was Geneva in a blur of motion as she swung her truncheon at Mohican's neck, causing him to stumble, grab his throat with both hands, and drop the padlock. She used one foot to shunt it away, delicate as a dancer, and then swivelled and kicked Mohican in the chest. He tried to grab her legs, and she took out her pepper spray and pressed down hard on the nozzle. Mohican let out a long, agonised scream, but Geneva didn't stop, bent over him, aiming the stinging mist directly into his eyes. Carrigan took his foot off the other man's neck and grabbed Geneva.
"That's enough!"
he shouted, pulling her away with one hand while using the other to open the front door. The street light and cold air rushed in, and Carrigan took a couple of deep breaths as he pulled Geneva through the door. She looked back once, her face twisted into a scowl. Carrigan remembered Carlston's comments from yesterday, felt his body start to ache and moan with pain, the sudden enervation as the adrenaline disappeared from his system. Something exploded on the path next to them, spilling its contents onto the cracked paving stones. Carrigan looked down and saw a trail of baked beans splattered across his shoe, the tin torn and twisted on the ground. Something else hit his shoulder, causing him to buckle. He looked up and saw an ashtray spinning through the air and ducked just in time.
"Run!"
he shouted, grabbing Geneva by the hand as more objects and projectiles began raining down from the high windows of the squat. They wove through the front garden, avoiding chair legs and potted plants, empty tea mugs, planks of wood, and a shopping trolley which just missed Carrigan, buckled and bounced and glanced his thigh. He saw Geneva stagger as a stone stung against her shoulder, and he grabbed her and pushed her through the gate. They made it into the car, shaking, breathing heavily, staring blankly at the road ahead. They both jumped in their seats as something smashed against the roof of the car. Geneva started the engine and was about to release the handbrake when the back window exploded in a shower of glass and noise. Carrigan looked through the gaping hole and saw 100 people, maybe more, spilling into the street. A few were chasing after them, but the rest had turned their attention to the Tesco Express, hurling objects and piling against the windows. And then he heard more breaking glass and the sharp, stuttering whine of the shop's alarm system as the mob piled in.
"Fuck, fuck, fuck!"
Geneva shouted, smashing her fist into the dashboard.
Carrigan turned towards her, but she was staring back at the squat. "I can't fucking believe it," she said, reaching for the door handle. Carrigan grabbed her arm. "What the hell are you doing?" "I've got to go back there. I dropped Emily's bag. Shit!" Carrigan eased his grip, and when Geneva turned in her seat, she saw that he was smiling. He slipped his hand into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small black notebook. Geneva's eyes widened and a smile cracked her face. She took the notebook and turned it over in her hand, tilting it so that it caught the overhead bulb light. The notebook was a moleskin, bound shut by a piece of black elastic. Geneva slid her fingers underneath the strap and snapped it open. The pages smelt of damp and hairspray. She flicked through pages of scrawls and lists, internet addresses, random notes, phone numbers, and then she stopped. This was a different section of the notebook, demarcated by several blank pages before it. She stared at the page on the right. There were only 7 words, written in large, chunky letters, a heading of sorts. M and N's Peru trip. August 2011. He's with me, by my side, but I don't really see him nor feel his presence. It may as well be a tree or a dog that follows you around because no one else will love it. But even dogs can be useful. Sometimes it's the dogs that tell us where to look. That first night we slept on the rocky ground as far away from the hanging trees as possible, and in the morning we set off along the road hoping to find help at the next village. He has a map and a tattered guidebook and a sure sense of where he is going. He says if we leapfrog across the highlands, village to village, we'll be able to catch up with the bus. Otherwise, it's a 2-week wait until the next one. Of course, all he wants to do is go back to the bars and alleyways of the town, to drink and tell his tale to gape-eyed college girls and gap-toothed scandies, and watch them swoon and melt. But it doesn't bother me anymore. At least, not in the way it used to. We hitch rides in the backs of ancient pickup trucks, the kind of thing you expect to see in a museum, belching black smoke and diesel stink, us rolling around in rusty beds among straw and farm equipment and animal shit. Each truck or car only goes as far as the next hamlet. These are the limits of their lives. The rest of the world seems cut off from this high, arid plateau, but, of course, that's only a romantic illusion, something we like to tell ourselves. If you look closer, if you can be bothered, you can see it seep through every crack of rock and bend of river. It didn't take us long to understand that this wasn't an isolated incident, that the trees of the high country carried familiar fruit, and that many villages were empty and abandoned like the one we had stumbled upon. On the second day, the smell came back, and this time there was no mistaking it for some natural occurrence. The back of my throat was sore within minutes. My skin felt hot and prickly. He coughed and popped some pills and pretended not to notice, but I could see him fighting back tears. The villages are strung out along these impossible peaks, 50 or 70 or 100 miles between them. Small groupings of mud huts and tin shacks, crumbling alleyways reverting to dust, leaning brick buildings, and always at the bottom of every ravine, the skeleton wrecks of smashed cars, a constant reminder of what we all want to forget. The villages are beautiful in their simplicity and setting, but most of them are deserted. There are old men sitting on stones in town squares and stray dogs that bark and sneer when they see us approach, but everyone else is gone. Most of the villages are empty, and the ones that aren't all slam doors and dark, suspicious glares. The old man we spoke to, or at least I tried speaking to in my crappy guidebook Spanish, just shrugged and flickered his fingers and waved as if to say they'd all flown away. There's something very wrong here. He refuses to admit it, refuses to even have that conversation, and the few people we do stumble on seem to share his reticence. He keeps telling me how much he hates it here, hates everything about it, The food, the backpacks digging into our sides, the miles of stumbling up and down hills, the endless sun-baked hours waiting for a truck or car to come by. But I don't feel like that at all. This thin, meagre air suits my lungs perfectly. The twisting hills and treacherous slopes strip the fat and drift I accumulated in the city. It's as if every part that was not a true part of me is finally slipping free into the high, clean air. I feel something strange and exciting, and I don't quite know what it is or how to express it. With each place we stop at, with each broken conversation and whispered warning, with each new story, I begin to understand what is happening here and why. I try to interest him. In London, this is exactly what would goad him into action. But here, in Peru, Nigel has become remote and distant, and as different from his normal self as this landscape is to the glass and concrete of the city. There is barely any life here at all. It is almost like the surface of another planet, barren and cold and stark. The thin air and rocky ground deter everything but the hardiest weeds. The animals all look like shrink-wrapped skeletons, and the people too seem stunted, closed in on themselves, each like a fist. Their mouths are tight, but their eyes give them away. The shrugs and grudging smiles hide a deep, unreckonable desperation, and you feel that anything can happen at any time. But people like to talk. People like to tell stories. We are such a curiosity to them, we may as well be from another galaxy, and, eventually, words are spoken, stories told. We hear about the mines. That's all we hear. How the mines have taken over the region. The foreign mines, where no one understands what the foreman says, but they all understand the cruel smack of his stick. We sit and listen as they tell us of rivers that float with death and strange shiny chemicals that swallow the sun. They say men come at night and take their children, that there are things in these mountains woken up out of millennia-long slumber. They talk of seeing the paramilitaries again, the rumble of boots and cruel smiles and blood stench. How they thought these days would never come again, but here they are. Everywhere we go, we hear whispers and rumours of a fenced compound high in the mountains, and people say the days of war and blood are coming back. And I can tell from their faces and the agitation in their muscles that they have waited their whole lives for this. They tell us about death threats and assassinations. They speak of the disappeared, ghosts walking the silent hills, demons roaming the Inca night. They complain about their persistent blood coughs, the black dust they bring forth every morning from their lungs, and they shrug and look up at the sky as if it owed them an answer. And then they look back down at the holy ancient ground that has been stripped from their very feet, and it makes me feel mad and restless and pale-eyed, and he's not even interested. He just skulks in corners and sits on backpacks and smokes his cigarettes. He makes me sick. I can't stand to be near him anymore. Even the way he moves his hand up to his jaw, that slow, deliberate gesture, repeated through hours and days in buses and sleeping bags, drives me crazy. But he makes me understand myself better. He's like a mirror in which I can see my former life, all those long and wasted years behind me. The posturing and pretending in small hot flats as if we, us, were the ones who were going to change the world. In the light of other people's suffering, our own seems so petty and small and pointless. In London we got angry about library closures and low pay rises. In London we protested against health cuts and housing benefits. But here, in the wind and blood, it is easy to see what is important and how, even in our worst moments, our lives are 1,000,000 times better than these people's. They would swap with us in a heartbeat. I left Nigel in that village last night. He'll wake up, shrug, catch tomorrow's bus, and be in town by nightfall, where he can go back to his act and tell his stories, and drink his beer and feel good about himself. Without him, I feel free. Without him, I feel new and unknown to myself. A mystery slowly unravelling after so many years of blindness. I talk to people in the villages, people on the highway, people out in the stony fields. They all tell the same story. They keep mentioning the compound in the hills. Their faces shade, and they look behind them as they say this. A place where gunfire is regularly heard, and chanting, and the cries of strange animals. They moan about the mine diverting their water for its machines, the constant blasting of the dynamite, the last fish seen in the river several months ago. They talk of doing something, of getting back at the bosses, but you can see in their sunken eyes and defeated mouths that there is nothing left in them but talk. I collect rumours, stories, and outrageous fabrications from each village I stop at. Are the men from the compound responsible for this? Are they soldiers? I ask them, but they pretend not to understand, or not to hear, or not to care. But I knew I was getting close to the compound when people became less willing to talk, when doors got slammed in my face, or the ground in front of me flecked by spittle. They say it lies on a hill, a gated fortress, a palace, a monastery, a torture centre. Take your pick. The stories varied, but the fear and apprehension didn't. A young man in a bar made of aluminium siding and old beer cans told me where it was. He was slow and hunchbacked, and seemed to be retreating into himself even as we spoke. Around us, farmers stared into their drinks, flies buzzed, and the world went on. I paid him his price and wrote down the directions he gave me. I can see it long before I reach it. 20-foot walls surround the building and stand stark and ugly against blue sky and silver peaks. The trail is well used, and it doesn't take me long to make my way up the hill, through a pass in the mountain, and onto the headland. 2 armed guards track me from their watchtowers. They swivel their mounted guns lazily and follow my progress up the hill. I can feel my heart beat, my skin itch, but I put one foot in front of the other because there is nothing else I can do. The soldiers are no longer slouching against their guns. They are up and jabbering into walkie-talkies and sighting down their barrels at me. I keep walking and taking deep breaths, trying not to stumble on legs that feel as though they're made of rubber. I hear the squawk and crackle of their radios, the eerie howling of the wind as it skips through the trees, and then a great wrenching as the main gate to the compound swings open. I stand 10 feet from the entrance and wait. The soldiers are right above me, their guns pointing down at my head, but I ignore them and keep my eyes fixed ahead. I expect more soldiers, more guards. But there is only an old man with a straggly white beard, a priest's collar, and a mischievous smile on his face. He holds his hands out and says in English, "Welcome, my dear. My name is Father McCarthy, and I'm so glad you found us." Chapter 34. Carrigan called an emergency briefing. Constables came in from days off or paperwork or street patrol. There was a sense of purpose and anticipation in the air as they took their seats. There was none of the usual moaning, bickering and fidgeting. Carrigan tapped his pen against the table as he waited for everyone to settle. Emily Maxted met Father McCarthy in Peru last year. It got their attention the way he'd known it would. He remembered the look in Geneva's face when she'd finished reading the diary, a stunned comprehension creeping into her features. Father McCarthy was in charge of some kind of gated compound in the San Gabriel region. We don't know yet what this compound was up to, what it was for, but it seems almost certain this is where the convent's funds were being channeled. Carrigan stopped and waited for them to finish writing their notes. We now know what connects Emily Maxted to the convent, but whether this has anything to do with the fire, I'm not so certain. He glanced briefly at Geneva and continued. We're maybe a step closer to understanding what the convent was involved in, but given that, I'm not sure we should be concentrating so hard on Emily Maxted. I think she's a red herring. Yes, she knew the nuns. Yes, she was there that night. But that could be all there is to it. No one said anything, all trying to take this in, to realign the case along new parameters. I really think that's a bad idea, Geneva ventured. We've just found the connection between Emily and the nuns, and it all links back to Peru. The money, the visits, the missing nun. I think we should be focusing more on Emily, not less. I don't think the nuns pissing off some dealer is enough to explain all this. He could feel them waiting for him to answer, but he took his time, measuring what she'd said, testing it against logic and probability. That's all well and fine, Miller, he finally replied, lowering his voice. But we have only a limited amount of resources, as you know, and we have to choose. We have to go with the odds. He wanted to see how she was taking this, but her eyes were glued to her notebook. Carrigan pointed to the photos of Victor and Duca pinned to the whiteboard behind him. We know the nuns had run-ins with local dealers in the alleyway behind the convent. We know the nuns were organising neighbourhood watch schemes and were leafleting outside known drug houses. A few weeks before the fire, we have a lieutenant in Duca's organisation visiting the convent 3 times. That same man was also watching the fire and assaulted me the next day in the ruins. Duca and Victor are our main suspects and remain so. They have motive, means and opportunity, and we know from experience that this is how these kinds of organisation tend to settle their problems. He turned back to the whiteboard and unscrolled a large-scale map of W2. He pinned the map to the wall, then stuck 4 red pins into it. I talked to someone in organised crime, and what he tells me about Duca fits the profile of the type of killer we're looking for. He pointed at the pins, a rough square marking the perimeter of Queensway. Duca owns 4 properties on our patch, each a suspected stash house, according to the drug squad. They don't know which house he's using at the moment. The Albanians change up every month or so to avoid being tracked. That said, if we can find which house Duca is using, it will get us closer to Victor. If nothing else, a raid will rattle Duca, cut into his profits, and maybe make him realise that giving us the fire starter makes more sense than having us come back every week. Yeah, fine. But how are we going to find out which house is the current one? Carlson asked. Carrigan shot him a dark look. That's the problem. We haven't got the resources to hit all 4 simultaneously, and if we get the wrong one, it will give Duca and his men plenty of warning to clear the real house. He studied the map. 4 houses, all standard terraced properties on quiet streets, all single residences. 1 on Gloucester Terrace, 1 on Queensborough Terrace, 1 on Hatherley Crescent, and 1 on Prince's Square. Now, if we... Shit! Everyone turned to stare at Geneva. She looked down at her notes, but there was nothing there. She flashed back to that day outside the house and gathered her thoughts together. Carrigan leaned forward, a curious concern darkening his face. Miller? Hatherley Crescent. You said Hatherley Crescent, right? Geneva thought of the man behind the door, his silver teeth and black eyes. Carrigan nodded. That's the one, Geneva said. That's the house we're looking for. Now it was Carrigan's turn to be surprised. He looked at the map, the red pin on top, as Geneva explained about the parking tickets issued to the SUV. She told them about ringing the doorbell the previous day, the expensive security setup, the man who'd answered the door. Are you sure? Carrigan asked. It would be a pretty big coincidence if it wasn't. Carrigan agreed. Carlson, get a surveillance team set up outside the house. I want them in place by tonight, when activity is likely to be at its highest. If Victor makes an appearance, then we've got him. Geneva sat at her table and went through the convent files as the team mobilised and gathered, their excitement suffusing the incident room but making it hard for her to concentrate. She hoped the answer would lie behind those flaked painted doors on Hatherley Crescent, but she felt the tug of the information at her She hoped the answer would lie behind those flaked painted doors on Hatherley Crescent, but she felt the tug of the information at her fingers, the Peruvian connection now made real and immediate by Emily's diary. She knew she couldn't let it go just yet. There were more things to uncover, more stories and secrets and hidden lives to unravel. She thought about Father McCarthy visiting the convent a couple of hours before the fire, his sudden decision to check into rehab, and picked up the phone. The editor of the Catholic Tribune remembered her, and she remembered that something in his voice which had so beguiled her the first time. "We're trying to locate a Father Callum McCarthy. The diocese told us he's checked into a rehab centre, and I was thinking the church must have its own facilities. They wouldn't use public ones, right? I don't suppose you would happen to know of any such centres, or where I could find this kind of information?" "No, that can't be right," Staples said, sounding far away and confused, as if she had just woken him from deep slumber. "What? They use public facilities?" "No, not that," Staples replied. "It's just, well, I don't see what Father McCarthy would be doing in such a place. As far as I know, he was teetotal." Chapter 35. Carrigan got to the incident room early the next morning, avoiding the chattering constables and ever-growing pile of messages, and shut himself off in his office. He scanned through last night's serials, scheduled the day's actions, then picked up the phone. He hadn't heard the voice on the other end of the line for a long time, but the laughter that greeted him instantly erased all the lost years. They got through the pleasantries quickly, both knowing that Carrigan would only call if this was important. "You're stationed in North Yorks now?" Carrigan asked, though he already knew the answer.
"Swore I'd never come back, but here I am."
Dialesh laughed, but it was one of those laughs that held an edge to it, as much incredulity as mirth. "I need you to look at a name for me."
"Work or personal?"
Carrigan said nothing.
"One of those, then,"
Dialesh replied, the coded assent contained in the ensuing silence.
"What's the name?"
Carrigan looked down at the page in his notebook where he'd written Geneva's ex-husband's name. "Oliver Jones. Anything you have on him. Even rumours, suspicions. Anything at all."
"I'll call you back."
Carrigan thanked him and put down the phone. He felt slightly bad for what he'd done, a little ashamed and grubby, but he knew that would pass. Geneva had told him she would deal with it herself, and that was fine, and as it should be, but there was no harm in having a little backup, just in case. He began sorting through his in-tray, reams of useless leaflets and best practice lists, all the things he hadn't got round to doing or had forgotten to, and then he saw what Berman had left for him, the convent's donor list. Several sheets of printouts, the type smudged and barely legible. There was a further note attached, Berman saying he'd been looking deeper into the convent's financial records and that the account the nuns were transferring the money to was held by something called the Tomorrow Foundation. Carrigan peeled off the post-it note and went back to the donor list. The list was made up of over 400 names, and the amounts donated were more often than not in the thousands. Holden had been right about that at least. The convent had a lot of influential friends and deep pockets they could count on. Carrigan ran his eyes down the list, making a mental tally of the amounts, figures multiplying in his head, and he realised they'd been wrong in thinking that the convent's finances were the result of some illegality. It was all here in black and white, legitimate and accounted for. As he went down the list, he recognised some of the names glimpsed in the society pages of the Standard, names of prominent backbenchers and sports stars, newspaper editors and property tycoons, a cross-section of London's Catholic hierarchy. And then one name stopped him dead. He stared at it, feeling his mouth go dry. The amount was not particularly high nor particularly low, but in keeping with the donor's salary, a generous but not overly extravagant tithing. Carrigan separated the page from the others and read it once more, as if unsure of his own eyesight, then folded it neatly in half and put it in his pocket. He was thinking about what to do with this information when Geneva burst into his office. "Yes?" He looked up from the screen, his eyes taking a moment to focus. She took a step forward, a smile appearing at the corners of her mouth. The surveillance van outside the house on Hatherley Crescent just spotted Victor entering the premises. Carrigan got up from his seat, loose papers fluttering to the floor, his shirt catching on the end of the table. "Are they sure it's him?" Geneva nodded. Carrigan crossed the room and picked up his jacket. He was about to put it on when he noticed a long, jagged tear he'd not seen before. "Get a car and some uniforms." "Already done it," Geneva said. "I told the surveillance unit to arrest Victor if they see him leaving the premises, but otherwise to wait for us to get there." "Good work," Carrigan replied, examining the lining and the rip, his fingers running along the stitching, a frown creasing his forehead. "So what are we waiting for?" She looked down at his jacket and said, "You." Chapter 36. Carrigan stepped back as one of the uniforms swung the enforcer and splintered the door open. The sound strangely muted in the chill air. The front hallway of the house on Hatherley Crescent was gloomy and dilapidated, the paint chipped and cracked, the carpet peeling and measled with stains, but 4 brand-new CCTV cameras were mounted at regular intervals along the ceiling. There were 3 doors on the ground floor, indistinguishable from each other, another hallway branching off, and a wide staircase leading to the upper levels. Carrigan studied the surveillance cameras and saw that they were all angled towards the staircase. He looked down at the carpet, noting it was far more worn leading up to the stairs. He heard something move, a faint whirring susurration, and he snapped his head up and looked at the cameras. They were no longer pointing towards the stairs. They were all pointing at him. They rushed the stairs, the uniforms following, all pretense of stealth discarded. The stairs ended in a solid wooden door. Just as he got there, Carrigan heard the lock being engaged on the other side. He gestured behind him, and one of the uniforms shuffled past and swung the ram in a long, deliberate arc. The door was no match for the enforcer, the wood and metal shearing away like tissue paper. 2 men were standing on the other side of the door. Neither one of them was Victor. One had a shaved head, a drunken, sleepy grin on his face, and his fly was undone. The other man was wiry and sinewed as an old piece of leather, with a widow's peak that dipped towards his nose. Both men had their arms up high in the air. The only other person in the room was a middle-aged woman sitting behind a desk and staring at a computer screen. Carrigan was momentarily disoriented. Had they somehow got the wrong house? It looked more like a dentist's waiting room than a stash house. There was calm pastel wallpaper and dimmer lights, potted plants and deep couches. A variety of pillows and coloured throws had been added to soften the atmosphere. Framed reproductions of Manet and Picasso prints hung on the walls. The uniforms were all looking at each other, their confusion transmitted in raised eyebrows and puzzled frowns. Carrigan turned and saw the man with the widow's peak studying him with a mild amusement, as if he had bumped into an old friend after many years in some unexpected circumstance. The man's top row of teeth were capped in silver and looked like shiny bullets lined up in a magazine. He was looking at Geneva with an easy familiarity and smiling. "Where's the other man?" Carrigan said. "Victor." "Where the fuck is he?" The 2 men stared at him as if they didn't understand English. 2 of the uniforms came running up the stairs. The sergeant looked tired and confused and angry. He told Carrigan they'd searched the basement and ground floor, but there was no sign of Victor. "Did you find any drugs?" The man shook his head. "Upstairs it is, then," Carrigan said, addressing the uniforms. "You find anything that looks like drugs, don't touch it. Radio me or DS Miller immediately. And make sure no one gets anywhere near a toilet. We don't want the evidence flushed away." He waited until he was sure they'd understood and started up the stairs. The smell of cheap perfume and bleach made his sinuses swell as he reached the second-floor landing. There were 3 doors to either side of him and a staircase leading up to another floor. Carrigan told one of the uniforms to watch the stairs, then pointed to the door on his left. They stormed into the room and stopped, and almost walked straight back out again. The room was small and narrow, with a single bed up against one wall and an armchair against the other. Loud, shrill pop music screamed and wailed from a small radio. A woman was kneeling in front of the bed. A man was sitting on the mattress, head flung back and eyes squeezed shut, still wearing his suit jacket, trousers bunched around his ankles. There was a stack of neatly folded towels on the edge of the bed and a box of tissues. The girl continued for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly, turning her head and finally noticing the policeman. She blinked twice and gulped and scampered on hands and knees to the far corner of the room. The other 2 rooms on the floor and most of the rooms on the floor above were also occupied. The men were surprised, then indignant, quickly turning solicitous and sorry when they realized what was happening. The girls cowered and whimpered, seemingly more scared by the police than anything which had occurred within the room. "Something's seriously wrong here." Geneva stood next to him. He hadn't heard her come up, and the sound of her voice made him jump. "I know." Carrigan scanned the long, dark corridor. "We haven't found any drugs yet." "That's not what I mean." Carrigan took the last door on the 3rd floor by himself, as the uniforms led the women and their pale-faced clients down to the waiting patrol cars. He knocked, but there was no answer, so he tried the doorknob. On first glance, he thought the room was empty, and was about to turn back when he saw a slight ripple disturbing the sheets. A young girl with short black hair slowly unfurled from the blankets, rubbing sleep out of her eyes with tiny hands and stifling a yawn. She looked about 13. There was a grey, raggedy Snoopy under her pillow, and she clutched it tightly with her outstretched hand. She managed a faint smile, then cast her eyes down to her feet and began unbuttoning her pyjamas. Carrigan told her to stop, repeating it softly when he saw the look of confusion and panic spreading across the girl's face. "You not like me?" she said, looking up, her eyes small, pleading things. "Please, stop that." He took a couple of steps back to give her some space, and then he saw her pouting her lips, jutting out her chest, and he turned away and slammed the door behind him. He told Geneva to call in social services, then saw the uniformed sergeant coming down the attic stairs. "Your man's not up there, but I think you'd better take a look," he said, a dark rage boiling in his eyes. He was gripping his truncheon so tightly it looked like the skin on his knuckles was about to pop, and Carrigan couldn't help but like him a little bit more for that. "He's got to be somewhere," Carrigan said. "He can't have just disappeared. Find him." The officer nodded somberly, and Carrigan climbed the last set of stairs alone. The door at the top had 2 5-inch deadbolts affixed to it. The metal looked worn and flaked and well used. Carrigan slid the bolts back slowly, his hands shaking. There could be nothing good behind a door which locked from the outside. The attic had been converted into the girls' sleeping quarters. There were 7 mattresses dotted across the bare wood floor and a cracked sink in the far corner. Next to it stood a portable toilet, the kind you would find on building sites or at music festivals. The smell was the same too, mulchy and rotten, hanging flat in the stale air. The mattresses were old and thin, overlaid with a patchwork of stains and bereft of sheets. The pillows still held the shape of their occupants' heads, and the blankets were worn and frayed. There were 2 skylights, but both had been panelled over with thick planks of wood, the nails hammered in tight against the window frames. The room smelled of bad, bone-shaking nightmares and 4-in-the-morning agonies, and he tried not to breathe the thick air, tried not to notice the stuffed rabbits and plastic Madonnas standing guard next to each mattress, the rolls of Band-Aids and lubricants. D.C. Jennings came up behind him and took one look at the room. "Oh, my God," he said, his face turning red and bright and his eyes blinking rapidly. "We've been through the whole house," he continued, getting his breath back, "and no sign of Victor anywhere." "What do you mean, no sign of him?" Carrigan turned so quickly that Jennings had to take a step back. "He can't have just disappeared, can he?" Jennings looked down at his shoes. "I'm afraid that's what it looks like, sir." Carrigan sighed and tried to control his breathing. "Fuck! How can that happen?" "But we did find the drugs," Jennings said, his voice rising in pitch. "How much?" "Maybe 4 or 5 ounces, all bagged in individual wraps, quite a haul." Jennings seemed pleased, but Carrigan wasn't. "That's not what we're looking for," he snapped. "There should be much more, unbagged. There should be scales and cash. I want you to go through everything, especially the office. Any computers, hard drives. They're not going to say fuck all unless we have something on them we can use." He watched as Jennings walked slowly down the stairs, his body folded in on itself, as if all the air had been punched out of it. Carrigan closed his eyes, took a deep breath, then snapped on a pair of gloves and started searching the makeshift bedroom. At least 7 women had spent their nights here. The mattresses were crowded together in one part of the room, as if their proximity would allow them some kind of protection against their keepers, or maybe it was just warmer that way. There were no heating appliances in the attic, the breath emerging from his mouth in thick, foggy clumps. The girls had tried to make it home with what little they could scavenge, and it gave even the most quotidian of objects a sense of pathos. He tried to imagine the lives these girls had led, the constant dread and physical pain, the any time of day call to go downstairs and do whatever some man who paid his money wanted them to do. They would close their eyes and think of the fields back home just before Christmas, their parents hunched over the stove, the pet dog they'd left behind. Then, when it was over, they'd fake one of a million fake smiles and silently trudge to the bathroom, rinse themselves, and go back to this drab and dusty room to drown themselves in their pillows. Chapter 37. The detainees from the raid were already sequestered in separate interview rooms when Carrigan got back to the station, their details being checked by constables and the attendant analysts recently brought into the case. Carrigan had gone through the interview strategy with his team earlier, his voice curiously detached. They all knew him well enough to know it was better to keep quiet when he got like this. They'd watched the surveillance tapes until their eyeballs ached. There was no doubt it was Victor who'd entered the premises a few minutes before the raid. The house had been searched top to bottom, but no trace of Victor had been found, nor any way he could have escaped. Carrigan couldn't fucking believe it. The one man who had a definite link to the case had somehow managed to disappear right before their eyes. They didn't have an Albanian translator, but they didn't need one, as the 2 bouncers didn't say a word between them. The first man spent the whole interview shaking his head genially and throwing his arms up in the air. The second man, the one with the widow's peak, was different. Carrigan and Carlson sat opposite him in interview room number 2. He was in his early 30s, his skin puckered and pitted with old acne scars. He smelt of lamb and wood smoke. "Where is he?" Carrigan sent the photo of Victor spinning across the table. The man could have been deaf for all the reaction he showed. His absolute stillness was unnerving. He leaned back in his chair and didn't answer any of their questions. His top row of silver teeth gleamed like spent shell casings in the stark white light of the interview room. "We know he went inside. We saw him. Did he take the drugs with him?" The man kept smiling, his eyes fixed on Carrigan's. They'd been in the room for 45 minutes and he'd barely blinked. Carrigan could feel a drop of sweat making its way down his spine. It was no wonder the girls had been so terrified. Carrigan took out the photos nestled in the green file beside him. The first was of the convent before the fire. He slid it across the desk. The man looked down at it as if it were a scrap of litter, then back up, his expression unchanged. "The nuns warned you not to sell drugs in that alleyway, right? But you didn't listen, and you didn't like them telling you how to run your business. You made several visits, and when they refused to stop, you burnt down the convent and got rid of your little problem for the price of a box of matches." There was no reaction. If he looked closely, Carrigan could see his own reflection fuzzy and upside down in the man's gleaming wall of teeth. "We know Duca was involved. We have Victor on tape visiting the convent." He took out Emily's photo and flicked it across the table. "What do you know about her?" The man picked up the photo, looked at it, then crushed it in his hand, sending the crumpled ball spinning back across the table. The woman was sitting by herself in a separate interview room. They'd left her there for the last hour and a half so that she could take stock of her situation. It was a general rule that the longer someone sat in an interview room by themselves, the more compliant they became. They stared at the walls, at the constantly buzzing video camera, at their own faces in the one-way mirror. Expectation was often worse than reality. Carrigan entered, followed by DC Singh. "Do you understand why you're here?" he said, taking his seat. The woman was wearing a lace top and short leather skirt. Her hair was in a tight, intricate bun that looked glazed. Her lipstick was smeared, and her nails clattered rhythmically on the table. "I've done nothing wrong," she said, sounding almost as if she meant it. "I'm not so sure about that," Carrigan replied. "You were caught in a house that was being used as a brothel. The girls, at least a couple of them, are underage. It's obvious you were the manager, Madame, whatever." He paused and watched as her face twitched and reacted, this last piece of information sinking in. "Now, maybe we can't prove the rest. Maybe your bodyguards don't say anything. Probably the girls will deny it all. But you were still found in a house with underage girls, and that's a very serious offence here." The woman kept drumming her nails on the surface of the table. Under the harsh glare of the lights, you could see the wrinkles and hard years etched on her face. All the small and not-so-small things she'd had to do to survive. Carrigan suspected she had been a trafficked girl herself, working the endless night shift until she got too old, her skin too loose, her body wasted, and then, instead of selling her off to someone else, they turned her into procurer and jailer. He rested his head in his hands, appalled by this cruel and logical cycle. "I told you. I know nothing. Now why you keep me here?" That might work if we hadn't found a 13- and 14-year-old girl on the premises. He took out the photos and laid them flat on the table. "This man assaulted a police officer. He's also wanted in connection with a murder and arson we're investigating," Carrigan said, seeing the slight flicker of dread pass through the woman's eyes as she glanced at the photo of Victor. "He was sent by Duca to burn down the Sisters of Suffering convent last week, wasn't he?" He saw something in the woman's expression shift. "I know you wouldn't have had anything to do with the murder of 10 nuns, but maybe you overheard something. Tell me what you know, and I'll make the charges go away." The woman looked down at her hands, the skin folded and wrinkled like topography. "There's nothing you can threaten me with that they won't deliver 100 times over." "We can protect you," Carrigan insisted, sensing a tiny crack in her wall. "We can have you moved to a different city, give you a different name. You'll be untraceable and you'll be free." It was his best shot. It was all she understood and all he could offer her. But the madame only laughed, that thin, derisive wheeze again, empty of any human referent. "You can protect me," she said. "You think so. Well, answer me this, detective. Can you protect my son? My 10-year-old son, who I haven't seen for 3 years?" Carrigan was suddenly confused. He saw a spark in the woman's eyes that had previously been absent, a slight awakening from the torpor and crushed fatalism of a few minutes before. "Son." "You think you know how this works, but you know nothing," she replied. "Can you protect my son? Can you? My son, who is being held by these men back home. You think I do this for fun, for money? The longer you hold me here, the more likely it is they will do something to my son. So please, I do not know anything. I do not see anything. Either lock me up or let me go before they think I have talked to you." She looked him directly in the eyes, her last and everything in that naked glare. Brothels in Bayswater were nothing new. The area had always been a conveniently located carnal playground, a pocket of anonymity and licence snuggled deep inside the heart of the city, a place where Victorian gentlemen had frequented the lavender-scented parlours of Porchester Terrace. Returning soldiers had celebrated their survival in dusty Praed Street walk-ups, and where Rahman had ruled over a vast empire of sex and cold-water flats. The oil boom sheiks of the 1970s and wayward minor Gulf royals had gentrified the business at the same time as introducing a new undercurrent of medieval slavery and micro-audited profit margins. The breakup of the former Soviet Union had turned it into a finely tuned production line. Every building in the city had a story to tell, and it was seldom a happy one. Geneva sat at her computer, reading up about this, trying to control the rage racing through her. The girls they'd taken in had ranged from 13 to 17 years old. They were scared and broken. They whimpered and cried in the van on the way to the station. They'd been raped daily for as long as they could remember, and the men who'd made sure they did their job, who knew where to place a fist so that the bruise wouldn't spoil a customer's pleasure, those men were sitting in the room behind her. She bumped into Carrigan in the corridor. He looked pained and drawn, and she wondered, not for the first time, how long he could keep this up. "Socko's found a hidden door in the kitchen pantry," he said. "It leads out into the back alley. That's how Victor got away. Bloody uniforms didn't spot it." "What about the girls?" "I want to try talking to them," Carrigan said. "Then we'll speak to someone in immigration, see if we can get them sent back to their families. There's no way I'm releasing them back into the arms of those men." Geneva felt a little bit better as they headed back to the interview rooms. The girls they'd found had all been seen by FLOs, social workers and other support staff. Their reports made Carrigan's eyes water. They were mainly from Moldova, Belarus, the Ukraine, trafficked through Sofia and Tirana, those beautifully named cities of sin and suffering. They were all in an advanced state of psychological distress, their bodies riddled with hidden bruises and cigarette burns. Carrigan entered the first interview suite and saw the girl he'd discovered sleeping. She was the youngest one they'd found. She was sitting cross-legged in the corner of the room, her back against the wall, and she was crying and talking to herself, nodding vigorously, then shaking her head in mute disagreement. The social worker was sitting on a folding chair, and when she saw Carrigan, she gave him a look that spoke of profound sadness and frustration. "I've got something for her," he told the social worker, slowly making his way across the room. The girl flinched at each footstep, burying her face deep in her hands. Carrigan leaned down and took out the Snoopy he'd retrieved from under her pillow. She looked up, her eyes red and wet, and hesitated. Then she quickly grabbed the stuffed dog and clutched it tightly to her chest, sniffling into its downy fur. Carrigan got up, nodded to the social worker, and left. He stood in the corridor and thought about what he'd seen and what he'd heard. He didn't want to think about the possibility that they'd been wrong, but he knew they were. He searched the incident room and interview suites until he found Geneva. "I think we've got this all wrong," he said. Geneva was nodding before he could finish. "We have," she replied. "Come." He followed her into the second interview suite. He kept his distance this time, sitting at the back of the room as Geneva took the chair opposite the girl. At least she was a bit older, this one. Maybe 16. Geneva placed a can of Coke in front of the girl, then said, "Please tell us what you just told me." The girl opened the Coke and took a long sip. She was obviously a teenager, but her eyes looked as weary as an old woman who'd seen several husbands and most of her children die. "We talk to each other a lot," the girl said, her voice heavily accented and hesitant. "There is no one else we are allowed to speak to. Girls are moved from house to house every week sometimes, so that we do not form any bonds, do not get comfortable, and because—" "Yes?" "Because the men, they like, how you say, variety? So yes, they switch us from house to house. I myself have been in about 15 different houses since I came to this country. You never know when they'll take you somewhere else, how much worse it will be, what kind of men keep guard in the new place. But the girls talk, and there are always rumours." "Rumours?" The scrape of Carrigan's chair as he edged forward startled the girl. "They say that if you manage to escape, there are people who will help you hide." Carrigan felt the skin tighten against his bones and tried to keep as still as possible. "What kind of people?" Geneva asked. The girl laughed derisively. "This, you understand, is like saying if you win lottery you can buy a new house. Escaping is almost impossible. Only a few girls manage it. They make sure of that." Carrigan remembered the bolts on the door to the upstairs room, the two bouncers whose job wasn't to keep the customers in line, but the girls. He couldn't stop thinking about these women, the dreams they'd have nurtured about England, the rock bands and nightclubs and glamour parties. And then they finally make it here, and all they see of the country is the interior of a locked room, the sweating, overweight face of the bank manager pummeling their thighs. "But there is this rumour that everyone keeps repeating," the girl continued, "that if you manage to escape, there is a place near here where you can find shelter, a safe house where they will keep you hidden from the men that will be sent to find you." "Do you know where?" Carrigan asked. The girl shook her head. "No. These are rumours, like I said. But the one thing they all seem to agree on is that if you manage to escape, there is a group of women who will provide sanctuary, and that these women are not ordinary women, but women of God." "Women of God?" The girl frowned. "Yes. You know—" Carrigan leaned forward, the pulse hammering in his neck. "Do you mean nuns?" The girl's eyes lit up. "Yes, exactly. Nuns." Part 3. Many of the rebels had no weapon except sand. Vasily Grossman. Chapter 38. The nuns had been sheltering escaped women, and if the women knew about it, it was almost certain their captors did too.
Geneva sat, thought about this, made notes, avoided going home. She told herself it was the case pressing against her, the spinning puzzlement of facts rolling through her brain. But when she closed her mouth, she could still taste his fingers and feel the hot, wet pulse of him on her tongue, and knew it was nothing to do with the case. She spread the files and papers and interview transcripts across her desk. The incident room had been chaos all afternoon, the subjects from the raid being processed and booked, and now the girl's story about the nuns sheltering escapees had changed everything yet again. Geneva looked at the grainy photos from Peru, the picket lines and clenched fists, and wondered whether she had been wasting her time. Worse, whether she'd convinced Carrigan to allocate personnel and resources that could have been better used elsewhere. She scratched her wrist until the itching stopped and opened a fresh can of Coke. She hadn't thought it would be like this. She'd been on the murder squad just over a year now. It was what she'd thought she'd always wanted. But she hadn't realised the responsibility embedded in every choice she made, the lives and futures dangling in the balance. She knew she had to do better, work longer hours, read through everything again, whatever it took. She printed off a large-scale map of Peru from the internet and spread it out in front of her. The country looked hunchbacked and folded, an afterthought in the shadow of the Andes. She remembered from Emily's diary that the compound was located in the San Gabriel province, and she quickly found the region, nestled between mountain and river. The nearest big town was Cusco. These coincidences no longer surprised her. The money from the nuns' bank account was funding Father McCarthy's compound. It took her half an hour to find the right number, another 45 minutes to get clearance to make the call. Countless forms to fill out and endless waiting. She didn't know what she was expecting. She didn't know if the person on the other end would even speak English. Commander Gamboa of the Cusco police force spoke English extremely well. He spoke it in that formal, almost stilted way that people do when they've learned it from old TV shows and news reports, and it made her feel curiously homesick, the ghost of her mother rising through every inflection and malapropism. "I was on my way out," he said. "Lucky I caught you then." She explained who she was and what she was working on. Gamboa kept saying yes, 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 his impatience mounting. But when she mentioned the Tomorrow Foundation, his tone changed completely. "We have been very interested in that," he said. When Geneva told him about the convent and the money transfers, he suddenly forgot the meeting he was rushing off to. "We suspect the nuns were funding some kind of compound through this foundation, but we have no idea why or what its purpose is." She heard something that might have been a chuckle on the other end of the line, but there was so much static and buzz that it was hard to tell. "So, you know about the compound?" Geneva felt her stomach tumble. She wondered whether to bluff him, but ended up going with the truth. "Yes, we do." "Wait just 1 minute," Gamboa said, and disappeared off the line. He came back and told her he had the files up on his computer. "As you can imagine," he continued, his voice steady and soothing, and so far away, "we have been keeping an eye on this place for the last couple of years." "Do you know what it is?" "We're not sure," Gamboa admitted. "It first came to our attention 4 years ago. No one knows how it started. One day there was just the bare ground, and the next there was a small wooden shack. The fence went up first. The villagers asked the workmen what they were building, but the workmen didn't know. The fence was laid over a large parcel of land. The land, when we traced it, was owned by the Tomorrow Foundation. Soon, villagers reported construction day and night, power tools and diggers and bright lights. In town, they began to notice a steady stream of outsiders passing through. They would stop for a night, then disappear into the compound and were not seen again. We,
the police, began to get interested. We saw priests and bishops, lawyers and soldiers come through town heading for the compound. A very curious collection of people. No one would tell us what it was or why they were headed there. The army provided us with some aerial shots, but all we could see was how well organized and constructed it was. Shipments were being delivered by truck almost daily. We stopped several of these trucks and searched them, but all we found were sizable quantities of food, tinned food, enough for years, even for a large group of people. There was no law against buying food, so we had to let them go. But then, roughly a year ago, we noticed that activities at the compound had stepped up, and we began to hear rumors of priests making large purchases of guns and ammunition in Cusco, and that was when we became really interested.
Geneva thought about the timing of this, the £240,000 coming in from the convent every year. Did you come across any English nuns during the course of your investigation?
We came across many nuns and priests, Gamboa replied. Did you have anyone in particular in mind?
She told him what she knew of Sister Rose, her trip to Peru and subsequent disappearance.
I know of the case, Gamboa said. We never found out who killed the priest she was traveling with, and we never found her body. Unfortunately, this is not so rare here as to warrant further inquiry.
Gamboa paused, and she could hear a fan spinning somewhere in the room behind him. Do you have a person named Emily Maxted in your records? Gamboa was silent, but she could hear him punching keys.
Yes, here we go, he said. She was arrested for taking part in an anti-mining protest in the Altiplana. When it was discovered she was a foreign national, she was released and deported from the country.
When was this? Geneva asked. Gamboa took a minute to look it up.
4 months ago, late July.
Any record of her link to the compound?
No, not that I can see, Gamboa replied. You know, I went up there one time. They had armed guards at the gates, but they let me and my partner in. We met the English priest, Father McCarthy, and he showed us around and told us that the compound was there to help minister to the spiritual needs of the people. But I saw the locked doors, the safety provisions and alarms, the frightened look in people's faces. She heard the slow pulse of the phone static, holding all the words Gamboa hadn't been able to say.
What happened?
We were taken off the case.
Geneva gripped the phone tightly between her fingers. Why?
The federal police took over, Gamboa replied. It's standard procedure when these kind of issues are involved.
Issues? What do you mean? There was a pause, and she thought he'd said all he was going to say, and then she heard him light a cigarette, the slow sizzle and exhale.
The compound had been mentioned in connection to a spate of incidents.
Incidents? What kind of things are we talking about?
I'm afraid that is classified. You'll have to go through Lima to get that information.
He paused, and she could hear him scratch his stubble.
Or you could use the internet,
he whispered, and hung up. Chapter 39. Roger Holden was on the phone, laughing at something in a booming baritone as he watched Carrigan and Miller barge into his office, his expression unaltered except for a quickly subsumed frown.
"I would say what a pleasant surprise, Inspector."
Holden put down the phone.
"But somehow I don't think this is going to be all that pleasant."
"That would be entirely up to you," Carrigan replied.
Holden looked down at the folder on his table, then carefully closed it.
Yes, quite, he answered. May I ask how the investigation is going?
As well as can be expected, Carrigan said. We're just trying to tie up some loose ends, and there are a few questions you can help us with. Holden smiled, but this time there was no warmth to it.
Fine, but I'm afraid we'll have to keep this short. I have a video conference with the Vatican all day tomorrow, and I need to prepare.
Why did you lie to us? Geneva interrupted. Holden turned towards her. His face was expressionless, but a small muscle jumped under his right eyelid.
I don't believe I lied to you, Miss...
It's Detective Sergeant Miller, as you well know, Geneva replied, taking a thick handful of papers from her bag. She took her time shuffling through them. They talked about their strategy on the way over. She would present her latest findings on the nuns, press Holden for why the church was covering up, and then Carrigan would come in swinging with the final blow. She took a little more time than was necessary, finding the right papers, and coughed and took off her glasses and wiped them on her blouse and put them back on again. You told us you only had a minor argument over theology with the convent, but that wasn't true, was it? Holden twirled the ring on his finger, mouth pursed.
What exactly do you mean, Miss Miller? I'm afraid you'll have to be more specific if you expect me to answer you.
Geneva bit the inside of her lip. Since talking to Father Spaulding, she'd been doing further research, staying up late, long scratchy hours on the internet, waste of time phone calls, digging and delving into old files and dusty archives. You said that it was a minor dispute, but I've heard it was much more serious than that. She passed over a photocopied page of the Catholic Tribune from last July. It says here that the convent was involved in a dispute not only with the diocese, but also with their own order. It says the dispute went up the chain all the way to the Vatican. Holden considered her silently for a moment.
And you believe everything you read in the press?
No, Mr. Holden, I do not. Which is why I sent an official request for information to both the Vatican and the Order's headquarters in Rome. I didn't think they would get back to me, but they did. I was told that the convent, Mother Angelica in particular, had been censored 3 times in the last 5 years. When I dug a little deeper, I discovered that there's a motion floating around the Vatican to excommunicate the nuns. It looks as if, had the nuns not been murdered, they would have been excommunicated from the church at the beginning of the new year. She passed across the relevant papers and typed transcripts. Holden picked them up and perused them slowly, stroking his chin and nodding his head as he did so.
You must understand that we in the church like to keep things in-house, he finally said. I imagine it's not too different from the police force. You have your own internal investigation department, and so do we. Likewise, we do not publicize every little coming and going within the church.
You haven't answered my question. The edge of Holden's mouth crumpled slightly.
Yes.
The convent was under investigation.
And yes, there was a motion for excommunication that the Order was going to vote on after Christmas, but I can't see how that has anything to do with your case.
Everything that happens has something to do with the case, Geneva said. And the fact you lied to us in the initial interview is something we do not forget. You made this seem as if the nuns were just innocent victims of some crazed arsonist, wrong time, wrong place. Yet the more we find out, the more that theory flies in the face of every bit of evidence. The nuns had secrets, Mr. Holden. These secrets leave traces. We're giving you one last chance to explain before we take this further. Holden stared at her, a silent calculation clicking away in his eyes.
What exactly did you want to know?
Geneva smiled to herself, relieved and a little surprised that she'd read him right. What did the nuns do to get themselves excommunicated?
They took things into their own hands,
Holden said, and this time there was something else in his expression other than the usual disdain. He blinked, then pressed a button and told his secretary to hold all calls for the next 15 minutes.
I wasn't lying when I said it was a matter of theology.
He leaned forward, sighing, his arms crossed in front of him.
Mother Angelica was stationed for several years in South America. I'm sure your research has led you to an understanding of this thing called liberation theology. Mother Angelica became too involved in the worldly sphere when she was in Peru. She got herself into a little trouble and had to be transferred.
You're talking about the Chiapeltec massacre. Geneva pulled out a set of grainy black and white photos and spread them across the table. I would call that more than a little trouble.
There were death threats against her.
Holden conceded.
We moved her to England to save her life.
And to save your reputations, right? You put her here right under your noses where she couldn't get into trouble.
You really don't know what you're talking about, do you?
Holden said, a slight amusement in his tone.
You have no idea.
Then tell us.
We had to relocate Mother Angelica because of the death threats. I wasn't lying about that.
Death threats from whom? The government? Holden nodded.
There was that. But we were more worried about the threats coming from the other side, from the workers and survivors of Chiapeltec.
Geneva felt something in her chest pop. Why? Why would they want to kill her?
You know about the bomb which killed all those people, derailed the strike and led to the massacre? We got word that rumours, credible rumours at that, were spreading through the village that Mother Angelica had brought in the Scarlet Fire, that she had okayed the use of the bomb. We had no idea whether this was true or not, but it was enough that people believed it to be so. We had to get her out of there.
Geneva sat back, stunned. She let the words run through her brain and nothing in there contradicted them. Do you think it's possible what happened at the convent is a direct consequence of that? Holden shrugged.
People kill each other for nothing, Detective Sergeant. You know that.
For something like this, who's to say? So, you brought her back here to get her out of harm's way, but it didn't work, did it? Holden leaned back, eyes plagued with useless hindsight and careful deliberation.
We monitored her closely, and for many years. It seemed that the change of location had served its purpose. Mother Angelica poured herself into outreach work, into helping the homeless and drug-sick, and many other worthy causes. The Church lifted the censure, happy that she had focused her liberationist tendencies on more fruitful ground. Then we began to hear rumours that she was recruiting nuns who'd fought alongside her at Chiapeltec, that she was withdrawing from her missionary work, that she had finally finished the book she had been working on for the last 17 years. One of the nuns who left the convent after a dispute with Mother Angelica told us about this book, A Calculus of Violence, a mathematical procedure which would tell you whether violence in any particular situation was justified or not. You can imagine the furore this caused when news of its contents leaked out. The Church does not sanction violence under almost any circumstances, certainly not violence by an individual.
Holden shook his head, in resignation, despair, or disapproval. Geneva couldn't tell. Maybe all three.
What these people failed to understand was that Jesus was not some bearded anarchist liberator, saving the oppressed from the tyranny of the state, but a spiritual liberator who saved them from the tyranny of their own hearts. We approached Mother Angelica and voiced our concerns, but she wouldn't listen to us. She was called to the Order's headquarters in the Vatican and told about the excommunication ruling. She refused to recant the book's teachings and stop publication. The excommunication was only a formality after that.
This was all about a book, Geneva said, surprised despite herself at what some people chose to stake their lives on. Holden laughed.
Isn't everything?
He sipped carefully from his glass.
The difference here is that Mother Angelica's book wasn't theoretical. It was meant to be used as an instruction manual in direct action. Its publication would have been a severe embarrassment to the Church.
More so than what they were doing in Peru. Holden stared at Geneva.
I'm afraid I don't know what you mean.
No, of course not, Geneva replied. We, however, do know that Father McCarthy was involved in running a compound in rural Peru that the convent was funding. We know Emily Maxted met him there.
I have no idea what you're talking about,
Holden replied.
Our remit is London, not Peru or anywhere else.
Still, kind of convenient for you that they all disappeared in a puff of smoke, Carrigan said. Holden turned slowly towards him, his face pale and rigid.
What exactly are you insinuating?
I'm not insinuating anything. I'm just making a statement. The excommunication of the nuns would have been bad press, and you've had a lot of bad press recently. This solves the problem rather neatly.
You're not seriously suggesting...
Holden paused. I'm going to speak to A.C.C. Quinn about this. He's a good friend of the bishop, as you well know. It'll be interesting to see what he has to say about your theories. At this point, Carrigan continued, knowing he was almost halfway there, all we know is that these nuns of yours were not the perfect saintly beings you made them out to be. They made enemies in South America. 5 of them had been tortured for their beliefs. They were involved in things we're only just beginning to grasp, and we now have strong indications that this may have led to their deaths. He paused, watching Holden carefully. The 11th victim, Emily Maxted, was spending a lot of time at the convent. She even slept in a room downstairs. We need to know why she was a regular visitor and what she was doing there that particular night. We know she knew Father McCarthy. He's the only one left alive who knows what linked Emily and the nuns, and you keep telling us he's unavailable, on retreat, whatever. It almost sounds like you're trying to cover something up. We need to speak to him, Mr. Holden. Holden's gaze drifted to the grey filing cabinets lined up against the far wall, then back towards the 2 detectives as he considered this, or pretended to be considering it, his fingers tapping against the armrest.
No, he finally said. I'm afraid I'm not at liberty to divulge his whereabouts. I suppose you could try and get a warrant, but you'll have to go through A.C.C. Quinn first.
I thought you'd say that, Carrigan replied. So you see, we have a backup plan. Backup plan? We need to find Father McCarthy, and we need to find him ASAP. As you're not willing to give us the information, we have no choice but to go public with our inquiries. He stopped and waited, faintly aware that he was holding his breath. Public? Do you mean... Carrigan tried not to smile. A full press conference, this time telling the public everything we know about the nuns.
You can't do that.
Holden was leaning forward, his arms clenched against the table, fingers pressing tight against the edges. It's the only option you've left us with.
What are you going to say?
Exactly what we have. That we believe the nuns were sheltering escaped prostitutes, that they were running a safe house for these women, and that the Albanians weren't particularly happy with this turn of events and burnt down the convent to teach them a lesson. Holden's face had gone white. The phone on the table started ringing, but he barely looked at it.
Whores. We believe the nuns were no longer happy to feed the homeless or minister to the junk sick, that they had stepped up their work and were running a shelter for escaped women who had been trafficked as sex slaves. "Oh my God," Holden said, his head collapsing into his hands. "You can imagine what the papers will do," Carrigan continued, feeling the crackle and buzz running through each word. "Full-page spreads, shocked commentaries, calling you up non-stop for quotes. With Christmas only a few days away, this will be their big story. Now, I know how much bad press the church has garnered over the last few years. Seems you can't open a paper anymore without reading about a paedophile priest or some former altar boy suing the Pope. As press officer for the diocese, I'm sure it's the last thing you or your bosses would want." Holden stared at Carrigan, motionless as a marble statue. He finally looked down at the table and picked up the phone. He spoke briefly to his secretary, then typed something on his keyboard. "I have to step out for a moment. I'm sure you two can see yourselves out." He stood up, looked down at them, frowned, and left the room. Carrigan got up, closed the door, and walked over to the row of filing cabinets lined up against the far wall. "What are you doing?" Each time I mentioned Father McCarthy's whereabouts, Holden glanced in this direction, he explained, pulling open the top drawer of the nearest cabinet. The metal screeched against the sides, making Geneva jump. "Keep an eye on the corridor," Carrigan told her, as he bent over the cabinet and started flicking through the folders. She opened the door and looked out, then ducked back in. "We shouldn't be doing this," she said, but he could hear the lack of conviction in her tone. "It's the only way we're going to find Father McCarthy," he replied, opening the bottom drawer. "And that's more important than confidentiality issues right now." He went to the next cabinet, stopped, and looked at her. "You have a problem with this?" She shook her head, and he turned back to the cabinet. The files were arranged alphabetically. There were several Father McCarthys, and it took Carrigan a couple of minutes to find the right one. A burst of footsteps sounded from the corridor outside. Carrigan quickly replaced the file and waited until they receded, holding his breath. Geneva stuck her head out the door, then gave him the all-clear. The folder was thick and bulging with stray papers, photos, and official documentation. It would have undoubtedly made for very interesting reading. A door slammed somewhere outside, followed by raised voices echoing down the corridor, getting closer. Carrigan flicked to the back of the file and looked at the last entry. It was a transfer form for Father McCarthy, dated the 15th of December and signed by Roger Holden. Carrigan scanned the photocopied sheet until he saw the address stamped in the bottom left-hand corner. He took out his notebook and started copying it down. Geneva glanced out the door and immediately popped her head back in, signalling that someone was coming. Carrigan finished writing and replaced the file in the cabinet. He crossed the room and showed Geneva the address. She stared at it for a long moment and was about to say something when her phone rang. Carrigan's beeper went off at the same time. They looked at each other silently. Geneva scanned the text Jennings had sent. She saw Carrigan fiddling with his phone, trying to access his inbox, and turned towards him. "They found Nigel." Chapter 40. They sat and waited on the cold metal benches while the pathologist got the body ready. Carrigan had booked their train tickets to Yorkshire for tomorrow, and he was impatient to talk to Father McCarthy, his feet tapping the tiled floor. Orderlies came and went, their faces turned into blank expressions of boredom as a shield against the mounting horror of their days. Like emergency rooms, Christmas was the busy period in the morgue. Geneva's phone broke the silence. She ignored the sharp looks and narrowed glances and checked the display. There were no messages from Oliver. There were no messages from Lee. She'd sent Lee a text in reply to his, and then she'd sent another one because the first wasn't quite what she'd wanted to say. But he hadn't answered, and she wondered if that part of her life was over too.
Milan was waiting for them downstairs, drinking from a large mug of milky coffee and flicking through a book in French. A radio was sitting on a shelf behind him, blaring fuzzy football commentary in what sounded like Serbian, a shock of cracking consonants and garbled imprecation, spluttered, spoken and shouted. "Ah, Mr. Carrigan," Milan said, brushing back his hair and getting to his feet. "I didn't think I'd be seeing you again so soon. I sent your superior the latest—" "This is about the body that came in a couple of hours ago," Carrigan interrupted, his eyes scanning the humped tables, each corpse a mystery to itself and others. "Of course, I should have known that would be one of yours too," Milan said. "They all like this, your cases?" "That's what your predecessor thought." "And look where that got her." Carrigan closed his eyes. He felt frazzled and enervated, so tired he could barely stand straight. He knew it wouldn't be long, could feel it in every twitch and ping of muscle. Too much coffee, too little sleep, and the spiralling data from the case all burning through his synapses like runaway horses. "Just tell me what you've got." "Okay. Yes, very interesting. I only managed to have a quick look, but that tells me almost all I need to know. Your man did not die easy. Someone certainly had their fun with him." Geneva exchanged glances with Carrigan, the giddy exuberance of only an hour ago replaced with a raw dread in her eyes as Milan walked over to the nearest gurney and pulled the sheet. Both Carrigan and Geneva had to swallow down their revulsion as they stared at what remained of Nigel the Nail. It didn't look much like a human body anymore. There were small red marks and huge black swellings dotted across his torso and legs. He was missing 2 fingers, 4 toes, and his right eye. His mouth had been sewn shut with fine white thread, and, in the dazzle of lights, it looked as if he'd swallowed a spider web. He vaguely resembled the man in the mugshots and photos. He barely resembled a man. "Are you sure it's him?" Carrigan asked. Milan laughed disdainfully and lifted the corpse's arms, the skin quivering like jelly as the broken bones settled within. Milan turned the arm around, and they could see that the burns and marks stopped at Nigel's fingers. "They made sure to leave his fingertips untouched," Milan said. "The fingers they left him with, that is." "How long has he been dead for?" Between 12 and 24 hours. Carrigan noticed the pathologist seemed distracted even as he was talking to them, his head tilting in a telltale gesture towards the radio whenever the announcer's voice suddenly rose in pitch, as it did now. Milan's whole body stiffened. The radio blared and roared, and the announcer shouted, "Goal!" A punctured holler that almost blew the speakers, the one word repeated like a burst of machine gun fire, transcending all language and culture. Milan squeezed his eyes shut and sighed and turned back towards the body. "They took their time with him," he said, pointing to the long serrated ridge of scars and wounds along Nigel's torso. A tapestry of burn and blister, the colours blending from pink to yellow to stark black. "This was done over a period of days, not hours, understand?" Geneva's head was spinning. "Tell me exactly what they did to him," she said, her voice distant and brittle. "What didn't they, young lady?" Milan sniffed, his lips disappearing behind his bushy black beard. "The people who did this, they were artists in their field. The Tintorettos of torture, the Picassos of pain. See those black and brown marks?" Milan pointed to a set of curiously uniform wounds on Nigel's torso. "Best guess is they used a cattle prod, and they used it repeatedly, mainly down below." he said, indicating Nigel's groin.
There is not much left of the private areas.
He pointed to the dark smear of bruises spiralling up both thighs.
They spent a lot of time on this region.
Jesus. Geneva looked away, but the bright gleaming metal surfaces and gargled sound of blood sluicing down the drain wasn't much better. How can anyone's body stand so much pain?
You'd be surprised at how much the body wants to survive even long after the soul has given up, Milan said. Of course, it helps that whoever did this kept reviving him.
Reviving him? Carrigan leaned forward, shocked by his own capacity to still be shocked by the acts of men. Milan indicated a faint line of bruises along Nigel's chest.
Those are from a defibrillating machine. This man was artificially revived several times so that he could face more torture. He was...
Milan blinked, cocking his head towards the radio, his attention snared by the commentary. Carrigan glared at the pathologist, walked over and turned it off.
"There's only 10 minutes left," Milan protested.
"Good," Carrigan replied. "Gives you an incentive to hurry up and tell us what we need to know." Milan stared at Carrigan, then shook his head and turned towards the corpse.
"They tortured this man with a variety of instruments. We'll send the tool marks off to the lab, but there's not much doubt they'll find these men used screwdrivers, chisels, and pliers, as well as more sophisticated electrical devices. We'll know better once I open him up, but it's not going to be pretty in there. That I can tell from the outside."
"They did all this to get information?" Geneva asked. Milan shook his head, his eyes almost disappearing behind the black bags of skin couched underneath his lids.
"You still don't understand, do you? This has nothing to do with information. This kind of torture is way too extreme for that. The man wouldn't have been able to speak. No, this was for fun, or for what some people call fun, or for something I don't even want to think about."
"You've seen this kind of thing before, though," Carrigan said. Milan looked down at the floor.
"I thought that by coming to this country, I wouldn't see such things again. But nowhere is really different from anywhere else, is it?"
"It was a professional job, then, in your estimation?"
"Oh, yes. Whoever did this has had plenty of practice."
Carrigan flashed back to videos he'd seen of what the Mexican cartels did to their enemies. Faces of children flayed and stitched to soccer balls left in their parents' front garden. Men naked and mutilated hanging from underpasses in the city centre. Rows of severed heads in the desert. The cruelty and level of sophistication Milan was describing fitted. It felt like Duca's work, and it made him wonder if they'd underestimated Nigel's role in this all along.
"There's something else,"
Milan said as he walked over to a silver wall-mounted table and picked up a small pair of scissors.
"We did an initial X-ray, and that's when I noticed it."
He squeezed his fingers through the tiny hoops and began to cut the thread which held Nigel's mouth closed. His movements were delicate and fleet, belying his size and bearing. He unsnipped the last piece of thread and gently lowered the jaw, then angled the lights until he was satisfied. He bent over the gurney and carefully inserted his fingers into the corpse's mouth. Carrigan and Geneva watched as he pulled his hand back out and opened it to reveal several burnt matches. Chapter 41. She sat in the canteen and tried to focus on the food in front of her, but all she could see in the red tangles of pasta were the twisted and torn remains of Nigel, the smell coming off his body, sour and earthy, the pathologist's last words as he flipped the corpse over. She pushed the plate away, finished her coffee, and went back upstairs. Carrigan was in his office, the door shut. She checked on the constables and uniforms, making sure they each had their assigned tasks and duties for the day, then made her way to her desk. She couldn't stop thinking about what the Peruvian policeman had told her over the phone, that last whispered comment of his. She thought about the particular words he'd used and emphasized, incidents and federal. And then she was typing into the search box, her fingers hitting the return key with a satisfying thunk. She scrolled down the search results, surprised at how many there were. She opened a separate window for each article and spent the next hour reading about strikes and sabotage, pipelines vandalized in the high mountain night, mine equipment monkey-wrenched into obsolescence, bombs strapped to the backs of donkeys in the marketplace. There were articles saying that the Shining Path were back and the old ways about to resume. Other articles argued that the Shining Path were a spent force and that these incidents were nothing but random grievances played out under hot sun and pale sky. She read about corpses dipped in battery acid and children's skulls placed along the highway like traffic markers. She learned about the cocaine corridors running across the dark jungle and threading through the ancient mountains. Rival gang shootouts, army incursions, the endless and familiar spiral of blood and revenge. She wrote down dates in a separate page in her notebook. Bombs, strikes, assassinations, kidnappings, drug hauls. She ordered the dates chronologically, then brought up the file for Sister Glenda's trips in a new window. She remembered the dates she'd noticed in the pub before Oliver had turned up, before... She shook her head, took 3 deep breaths and focused back on her task. Her eyes flicked across the screen and back. Her pulse strained against her skin. Her mouth went dry. She felt the tug and urge of a cigarette, but she ignored it as she compared the 2 sets of dates. During the week of Sister Glenda and Sister Rose's trip to Peru, a mine in the San Gabriel region had been shut down for 3 days due to a sabotaged generator. On Sister Glenda's first return trip, a pipeline in the remote Acaria range had been destroyed by a homemade explosive device. Sister Glenda's third trip coincided with the kidnap of a company executive. Geneva double-checked the dates. Each of Sister Glenda's subsequent visits fell during a week in which an incident had occurred in the province. She looked up the incidents and saw they were all directed at mine and logging operations. She began to discern a pattern. A peaceful strike, broken with hoses and tear gas and bullets, followed by an act of sabotage against that company's property. She saw the gradual escalation, the inexorable drift from strikes and walkouts to vandalized equipment to murder. And she wondered once again just what on earth had the nuns been up to. Chapter 42. The city never ended. You could look in any direction and there it was, chasing the horizon. And yet Carrigan could think of no other place he'd rather be than up here on the roof alone, in the spray and slash of wind, 12 floors of activity below him, and only the dark sky above. He'd hated the new building when they'd moved in last year. The ergonomically planned cookie-cutter offices, the persistent smell of new carpet and paint, the constant hum of the air conditioners and computer monitors. And then he'd found the roof. No one else seemed to know about it, or care. You took the lift to the top floor, past Branch's office and up a set of stairs, then through a door that said "Do not open," and suddenly the city was gone and you found yourself alone in sky and wind. He'd spoken to Karen again, a conversation rendered in hushed tones and silent expectation, and they'd made a tentative arrangement to meet up for Christmas dinner at her flat. It left him feeling a bit better as he unwrapped a bar of chocolate and watched London lying hidden under a soft blanket of snow. Days like these, you could almost forget the daily evils and petty feuds which occurred in the city's shuttered houses, the lost and broken people dragging themselves through its cold, closed streets. The snow had begun again, small round fluffs falling at his feet and turning the air into a random dance of particles. Behind him, cars flashed on the elevated motorway, fleet and shiny on their way to somewhere else. He remembered how Louise had always insisted he come outside with her at the first sign of snow. They would huddle in the hallway, donning thick coats and hats, and God, how he missed the electric sting of her excitement as they stepped out onto the street, her eyes and heart instantly ensnared by the wonder of falling things. But he couldn't make the memory last. The case came roaring back, scuttling his thoughts. The girls hadn't talked. They'd had to release the suspects from the brothel raid for lack of evidence. Carrigan had contacted immigration and detailed Jennings to make sure the girls would be processed and fed and sent back to their own country and kin. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He thought about Geneva, how the state of Nigel's body had shocked her. He could tell by her silence in the morgue and the way the skin above her cheekbones rippled as she stared at the torn remains. The torture bore all the hallmarks of Duca, and the matches seemed a message directed at them. But what kind of message was Duca sending? Were the matches an indicator of Nigel's guilt, Duca having heard about the raid and wanting no further interruption of business? Or were they a big fuck you from the Albanian boss? And what did Duca and Nigel the Nail have to do with each other? Carrigan didn't want to contemplate the possibility that if Nigel was indeed the arsonist, then the trail and the case were, literally, dead. But Nigel didn't make sense. And he didn't make sense just when things were beginning to make sense. If the nuns had been sheltering escaped women, then the fire was an act of retribution and a warning to others. But Nigel kept poking at Carrigan like a stray burr. Nigel and Emily, the two pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit. Tomorrow he would go with Geneva to a small monastery high up on the North Yorkshire moors and finally talk to Father McCarthy, and maybe he would understand a little more. He finished the last piece of chocolate as the stairwell door slammed shut, a harsh burst of sound ripping through the clean, crisp air. Carrigan turned and saw D.S. Bird coming towards him, a dark, deranged figure flecked by blowing drifts of snow.
"You bastard!"
Bird yelled when he was 20 feet away.
"You fucking bastard!"
Bird was speeding up now, feet slapping against the asphalt, his face twisted and canted, arms raised wildly at his sides.
"Idiot!"
Bird leaped and threw himself against Carrigan. Carrigan flew backwards, his arms scraping painfully against the rough gravel, pain shooting up his back, his vision blurring.
"Get up, you cunt!"
Bird screamed. Carrigan's head was a foot away from the 12-story drop down into the waiting snow. The wind felt like razor wire as it whipped across his torn skin. He rolled over on his side, away from the yawning ledge, and got to his feet warily, fighting a burst of dizziness and straightening his collar.
"What the fuck do you think you're doing?" "I should be asking you the same question."
It was obvious that Bird had been drinking, and that he'd been drinking for a long time. His face was flushed, his jacket flung open, his zip half undone. His breath was sour and rank, and his hands were curled into tight fists. Carrigan slowly moved away from the edge and steadied himself against the adjoining wall, getting his breath back, all the time keeping his eyes on Bird.
"What the hell are you talking about?"
Bird hovered over him, the muscles under his shirt popping and flexing, his eyes blinking rapidly.
"Oh, fucking innocent now, aren't you? You piece of shit!"
Bird dived at him, and Carrigan managed to sidestep most of the impact, but not all. Bird's shoulder caught him on the collarbone and sent him spinning against the wall. The hard concrete crashed against his spine as Bird pressed his left arm crosswise against Carrigan's throat.
"You screwed everything up! Jesus! Where the fuck was your head? I told you to tell me if you were going to do anything like this, and what do I get? fuck all from you. And then I read the serials and see you've gone and busted one of the places we had under surveillance. One of the places I told you we had under surveillance.
Bird jammed the side of his arm deeper into Carrigan's throat, the bone pressing hard against his Adam's apple. Carrigan was about to say something, then stopped.
You wanted me to go in, didn't you?
The realization ran down his body in soft, shuddered jumps.
You wouldn't have been so free with the addresses otherwise.
He looked for Bird to deny it.
What? You couldn't get enough for a warrant? You knew that once I spotted Victor I'd go in, didn't you? You were hoping I'd rattle Duca's cage for you.
Bird pushed against him harder, his knee pressing deep into Carrigan's thigh.
I don't know what you're talking about. You screwed up a major operation and you got everyone killed. Happy?
He backed off, and Carrigan managed to get his breath back, doubling over, his hands planted on his knees so that Bird wouldn't see them, shaking.
What do you mean, I got everyone killed?
Bird shook his head. Depleted by his efforts or by Carrigan's ignorance, it was hard to tell which.
What the fuck's the point now? They're dead, and you killed them.
We closed down a brothel with 13-year-old sex slaves in it. That's what matters. That's what I care about. Bird turned and spat on the ground, his breathing heavy and laboured.
Those bouncers you arrested, you know what's going to happen to them? Haven't talked, have they? Kept their mouths shut, denied everything, right? You've probably already had to let them go. Tell me, how am I doing?
Carrigan didn't need to nod, the expression on his face confirming everything Bird had said.
You know what's going to happen to them the minute they're released? Duca's never going to be sure how much they said or didn't say in that interview room. Better safe than sorry is how Duca got where he is. They're probably dead already, or strapped to a chair in a warehouse somewhere, getting more intimate than they thought possible with a Black & Decker. Frankly, I don't give a shit about them. It's what they deserve. But they'll do the same to the Madame. Can't trust her now, can they? Maybe she made a deal with you.
Carrigan shook his head, but he knew that Bird was telling the truth, and that he'd been too rash or too naive or just too damn stupid to realise this before he'd gone charging in. He thought of the Madame's son locked away somewhere in Albania, and the way she couldn't stop tapping her fingernails against the table, as if she needed a constant reminder that this was all real and not some nightmare conjured up from fear and ancient dread. "We saved the girls," Carrigan protested. "While you were doing your surveillance and gathering evidence, those underage girls were being raped in there. We got them out, and we're going to make sure they get back home." Bird seemed almost sorry for him when he replied.
Do you have any idea what's going to happen to those girls when they get home?
He laughed. A cruel, derisive wheeze scraped from the back of his throat.
Home is run by these thugs. Guess what they'll do to them when they reach Albania?
I don't want to know.
Well, fuck that. This is on your head.
Bird grabbed Carrigan's collar and cinched it between his fists.
Those girls will be picked up from the airport. They'll be taken to a safe house somewhere in the country. They'll be beaten and tortured for a month, maybe 2, both as punishment and to see what you guys said to them, what they may have said to you. Then comes the good part. They're damaged goods now, so they'll be sold off for the hard stuff. You know, the guy who likes to bite off nipples when he comes. The one who likes to get inventive with instruments, to use animals and get off on the screams. They have entered the lowest rung of whore hell, thanks to you. Believe me, they'll wish they were back in the brothel.
Bird shoved Carrigan hard against the wall, shook his head in disgust and walked away, disappearing into a blind haze of dirty snow. Chapter 43. Carrigan and Geneva picked the car up in Leeds. The train station was swarming with young men wearing tight white T-shirts, their arms clasped around tawny blondes in pencil skirts and impossible heels. They were coming in from the outlying towns to buy presents, get drunk and fight. Carrigan thanked God he was no longer working street patrol. The car was tiny, not at all what he'd booked over the internet. It looked more like a rich kid's toy than something that could get them to Burnham Monastery. Carrigan was squeezed into the driver's seat, the steering wheel crashing against his knees with each bump of the road as Geneva smoked quietly out the side window. They left the high-rise apartment blocks and grey flyovers behind them and entered a blank and featureless world, devoid of form and shape, as if some creator had wiped the slate clean, unsatisfied with his creation. As they climbed away from the city, the snow started falling in heavy spiralling drifts, the wipers working frenetically, screaming and squeaking against the windscreen. Carrigan saw Geneva texting, reading an incoming message and smiling, then trying to hide it, her brows knotted together in a tight squiggle above her eyes. He was glad there was someone whose text could make her smile and clutch her phone a little tighter. But the look in her eyes was complicated by a fleeting shadow that briefly crossed her face. They drove in silence for the next 30 minutes, the motorway deserted as it humped and straddled the rolling sea of moors. It was a landscape without feature, made doubly so by the thick layers of snow. Silence enveloped them, so that all they could hear was the wet slap of the tyres and their own ragged breathing. A few minutes later, Geneva pointed to an unmarked road curving off from the motorway, and Carrigan swerved into the narrow opening. The car heaved and groaned as the surface of the road deteriorated. The snow had been cleared overnight, great ridged humps on either side of the tarmac, but the wind was blowing it back in slanted drifts that twirled and scurried along the surface of the road. The monks had seen their approach for miles, a tiny black speck on the horizon steadily growing in size. One of them was standing by a big wooden door built into the surrounding wall. Carrigan got out of the car, put on his jacket, and rubbed the feeling back into his hands. They trudged through deep drifts, the trees sleeved with snow, the wind howling at their backs, forcing them to walk bent over, and he was out of breath by the time they reached the gate.
"Bit far from home, aren't you?"
the monk said, peering through old-fashioned Coke bottle glasses at his warrant card. Despite the thin robe and bitter wind, he didn't seem at all affected by the weather. "We're here to speak to Father McCarthy," Carrigan said, watching his breath cloud and fog in the frigid air. "We've come up from London."
"You'll be wasting your time, then?"
the monk replied, not discourteously. He looked like some minor functionary in a vast system, an apparatchik without conviction, grey and remorseless.
"We don't allow visitors."
"We're not visitors. We're investigating a murder." Carrigan's feet were beginning to turn numb, and he could feel the first dull throb of a bad headache. "Roger Holden gave his express permission," he said, his voice steady, eyes unblinking.
"This is a private facility. There's no visitors."
The man tried to sound firm, but the jitter in his eyes gave him away. "Call Holden," Carrigan said. "Ask him yourself. I don't have time to waste." The monk was undecided for a moment, then, surprisingly, plucked a mobile from the folds of his gown. He looked up at Carrigan and dialed. Carrigan watched as the man talked to Holden's secretary, his voice turning deferential and unctuous.
"Mr. Holden's in a video conference and unavailable all day," the monk said, a smile appearing on his face, "and without talking to him, I can't let you in."
Carrigan took a step forward until they were breathing the same air. "This is a murder investigation," he said. "This is about 10 dead nuns, and whether we find out who killed them or not. Do you understand?" The monk gave the slightest of nods. "You can let me in," Carrigan continued in his most reasonable voice, "or you can come back with me to the nearest police station on an obstruction charge." The monk didn't reply. He stared out at the white wasteland behind them, then nodded imperceptibly and turned, leaving the gate open. They followed him into a large courtyard surrounded by huge stone walls. They had expected it to be empty and were surprised to see 7 or 8 priests working the frozen fields. They wore threadbare habits and no gloves, sandals on their tiny gnarled feet, and they were wielding shovels and scythes, digging and furrowing the hard, icy ground. None of the priests showed the slightest interest in them, their eyes fixed on their hands and the tools they held as they swung in some unspoken rhythm, their faces flushed and perspiring freely despite the cold. As they neared the main building, Carrigan could see more priests milling around the grounds, each one attended by an orderly. The priests ranged in age from very young to shriveled figures lost in their wheelchairs, but they all seemed to share a certain expression, a commonality of suffering, the puffiness around the cheeks, the sadness in their eyes, a dishevelment of body and soul. The monk led them through an airy and dark vestibule. The walls were bare stone, and the cold and wet seeped through the cracks like smoke. They passed several monks kneeling in front of a large wooden crucifix, their heads almost touching the floor, and then went up a set of stairs that creaked and swayed under their feet, and into another long corridor with doors evenly spaced along both sides, the smell harsh and sharp, industrial cleaning products and antiseptic mixing with the odour of confined men. The door to Father McCarthy's room was locked from the outside, and the monk reluctantly selected a key from the large silver ring hanging at his belt and turned the lock, the jambs creaking and shrieking like wild cats as they retracted. Father McCarthy was sitting on a hard-backed chair facing a white plastic table. He didn't look up as Carrigan and Geneva entered and introduced themselves, his eyes focused on a large bowl resting between his enormous hands. The room was small and sparse. There was a narrow metal-framed bed up against one wall, a simple table with books lying stacked and splayed on it, a jug half filled with water, and a large black crucifix, the wooden floor below it worn and sanded smooth by the constant rub of knees and shins.
"You took your time,"
Father McCarthy said, taking a big mouthful of stew, his lips smacking against the spoon. He was eating some kind of broth, a thick, blood-red gloop with dark kidneys and pellets of grey meat floating inside. His face was almost perfectly rectangular, and it was huge, a concrete slab of a head framing deep-set eyes, his wrists almost the width of Carrigan's hand. His beard was wild and unruly and totally white, and, when he turned his head, Carrigan thought he could see the sheen of old scars on his puckered skin. McCarthy ignored his scrutiny and continued staring down into his soup. "You weren't easy to find. Holden made sure of that." Carrigan paused and stared at the old priest. He was somehow everything the stories and rumours made him out to be. "Why did he put you in here?"
"Why do you think?" McCarthy replied. "The church wants to protect its image. When they heard about the fire, they knew you would find me, and maybe the press would too, and that their precious little secret would end up as tabloid fodder. So here I am. But it's good you finally found your way to me. I knew you would. I need to get out of here," he said. "I need to resume my work."
"And what work is that, Father?" McCarthy put down his spoon.
"You know exactly what kind of work I'm referring to, Detective. Otherwise you wouldn't be here."
Carrigan suppressed something that was close to a smile. "We're aware you knew Emily from Peru, and we know what the nuns were up to." He took out Emily Maxted's photo and handed it over to the priest. The paper disappeared in McCarthy's hands as the scored and wrinkled flesh caressed the image.
"Emily."
The priest nodded softly and handed the photo back.
"Emily was our saviour.
Geneva tapped her pen against her notebook. What do you mean by that? McCarthy went back to his stew, stirring the juice with his spoon.
When I first met Emily, I knew immediately she was the one I had been waiting for.
Waiting for? Geneva asked, the pen sticky between her fingers.
They only come along once in a while, people like her. People with the true fire burning within them. The ones who'll do anything for what they believe in.
Including breaking the law? Father McCarthy looked at Geneva and smiled.
There is only one law, and that is God's law. Tell me, what import do your jails and life sentences have against eternity?
Is that what you were doing at the compound? Following God's law?
I was doing what I've always been doing. God's work. The work the Church has forgotten about in its haste to catch up to the 21st century. You've heard about the book Mother Angelica was working on the better part of her life? The Moral Calculus?
They both nodded.
The compound was an experiment in putting those theories into practice.
I thought the book had been suppressed by the Vatican, Carrigan said. Father McCarthy nodded slowly and took another slurp of his soup.
That it was, but random chapters, lost pages, abstracts and glosses had crept out over the years. People in the church, priests and nuns on the ground, read these fragments avidly and collected them and passed them around.
Why Peru? Geneva asked.
I'd been involved in Peru since the summer of '73, and, if anything, the situation was worse now. Sure, the dictatorship was gone, the civil war engendered by the Shining Path was over, we had a president who was voted in. But nothing has changed. The mines are operating with impunity, the rivers polluted with cyanide, entire species are dying off, workers being exploited. The mine company has even bought up all the local medical clinics so that reports of toxic poisonings and industrial accidents never see the light of day. And then, on the other side, you have the drug barons. Ex-Shining Path men now forcing villagers to grow coca, burning their fields and taking their women. The church pretended it wasn't happening. The world was more interested in other wars. Something had to be done.
Geneva leaned forward. The sabotage and bombings? Is that what you mean by something had to be done?
These things are sometimes necessary to stop a greater evil,
McCarthy replied.
That's what Mother Angelica's book was about. That's what the point of the compound was.
Did you and Mother Angelica set it up together? Father McCarthy shook his head.
I wrote to Mother Angelica a few years ago and told her how we had organized the camp according to the principles outlined in her book. I thought she would be pleased. But she was a long way away, both in time and space, from what was going on in Peru, and she'd lost her fire in the intervening years. She was content with helping the homeless, handing out leaflets, and sheltering escaped prostitutes. We were running out of money. We needed a steady and constant tithing if we were to fulfill our mission. I wrote to Mother Angelica again and begged her to come and see what we were doing, but she refused. Then I met Emily. She'd become very interested in the plight of the local people. She wanted to know what she could do to help. She reminded me of Mother Angelica the first time I saw her 40 years ago on that dusty dirt road leading up to Chiapeltec. The same spirit and fire, an equal ferocity. And I knew Mother Angelica would recognize it in her too.
You sent Emily back to London to galvanize the nuns into action, to help fund your compound.
They had lost their way. Someone needed to show them how to get back. Like I said, Emily was our savior. She possessed the very thing the nuns had lost, the excitement of youth and the unwavering belief in one's own power to change the world. The nuns had already fought their battles in South America, in Africa, in all the world's dusty, forlorn places, and they had lost. Emily spoke to us of her time in the protest and anti-war movements, the screaming barricades and late-night beatings, and there was a sparkle in her eyes as she said it. Oh, yes, a touch of trouble and madness, too. But beneath all that lay a pure white flame of indignation. All the nuns recognized it. Emily reminded them of who they'd been and what they'd lost.
Something in the priest's eyes mellowed when he said Emily's name, intoning it as if it were a benediction. Well, it all sounds very high-minded, but I don't see how these ideas led to bombed-out buses, blown pipelines, and dead executives, Carrigan said.
Every action the compound took was in strict accordance with Mother Angelica's moral calculus. Every action was weighed and discussed and deemed necessary and proportional and more likely to do good than harm.
So what went wrong? Carrigan asked, and it was hard to tell if he was being sarcastic or not. It seemed for a moment as if McCarthy wasn't going to answer, his eyes locking onto Carrigan's with such a piercing glare that it felt as if he were weighing his soul.
Where does anything go wrong, Inspector?
The priest smiled.
You know as well as I do that there are no hidden meanings scribbled in the margins of ancient texts or obscured in the mathematical pattern of letters and spaces. There is no meaning in planetary motion or the disposition of tea leaves, nor is there meaning in coincidence and similarity. There is nothing but actions and their consequences. It didn't take Emily long to do what she was sent to do. She convinced the nuns that sheltering escaped prostitutes wasn't enough, that they should stop being so passive in the face of evil. She told them about the compound and the conditions she had witnessed in Peru. A couple of the nuns came and visited. They saw what we were doing, and they saw what the mine companies were doing. They embraced the cause wholeheartedly. They reported back to Mother Angelica, and the money started flowing in.
But Sister Rose McGregor never reported back. Geneva's voice was clipped and low. Father McCarthy looked momentarily stricken, and for the first time Carrigan could see how old he really was.
I blame myself for that, the priest said. It was the last day of her trip, and we were conducting masses for the local village. Sister Rose kept asking to see one of the mines we'd talked so much about, and Father Ramirez offered to take her.
Father McCarthy looked down at his shoes.
3 weeks later, we found Father Ramirez's head in our front yard. Sister Rose was never seen again.
One of the nuns, Sister Glenda, kept coming back, though, Geneva said. I also noticed that her visits often coincided with incidents occurring in the region. Father McCarthy nodded.
As time went on, the nuns wanted to see if they were getting their money's worth, if we were making a difference. Of course, we also showed them the free clinics we'd set up, the new schools and missions, defence lawyers we had on hand for the workers, and the fund we kept for striking miners' families. And that was our job, to fight back on the side of the poor by whatever means were judged necessary and proportional. As you can imagine, after Sister Rose's disappearance, the nuns' commitment to the cause increased greatly.
So this was all about Mother Angelica taking liberation theology too literally? McCarthy's eyes creased.
It's meant to be taken literally. That's the point.
Then why didn't they try to escape the fire, if their mission meant so much to them?
Would it have done them any good?
McCarthy said with a flat, stony stare. No, Carrigan conceded.
No, exactly. And they knew that. They had nothing to fear from death, Inspector. On the contrary, they would have realized their situation and would have stayed sitting at the table making their last amends and preparing for the life to come.
Would they have had their rosary beads out?
Yes, it's quite possible they did.
It sounds to me like they knew they'd done something wrong, gone too far, and were making amends.
Ah, wouldn't you like to believe that? McCarthy said. It would make it so much easier, wouldn't it? But you have to remember the compound was an experiment in direct action, in accordance with the Bible and Jesus' teachings. We weren't revolutionaries or rebels. We were priests and nuns doing God's work.
And it got them killed. McCarthy turned to face Carrigan.
I don't know that it did.
What do you mean? Father McCarthy smiled.
Well, you've asked me a lot of questions about Peru and the compound, but you still haven't asked me about the night she came back with blood on her clothes.
Chapter 44. What do you mean she came back with blood on her clothes? Carrigan said. Are you talking about Emily? Emily Maxted? McCarthy nodded and pushed his bowl aside. He reached for a packet of Senior Service lying on the table next to him. He grimaced as he lit the cigarette, the scent instantly filling the room as he exhaled a spiralling twist of smoke from his nostrils.
I told you the nuns had been sheltering escaped women. They'd bring them in through the back garden and hide them in the priest hole. Emily persuaded them to take it a step further. Not to wait until the lucky ones managed to escape, but to snatch them from the hands of their captors. It didn't take much persuading. I suspect it had been Mother Angelica's unspoken conviction all along. Emily watched the Albanians and got to know their routines. The women were only ever let out when they were being transferred to another brothel. Emily and her accomplice would wait outside, then grab the woman and be out of sight before they even knew what had happened.
Accomplice? Carrigan said, reaching into his file and pulling out the mugshot photo of Nigel the Nail. He passed it to the priest, watching him nod, a slight curl of distaste appearing on his lips. Not the kind of person you would want to have dinner with, but the right kind for the job. He handed back the photo, evidently not wanting to hold on to it any longer. He'd been travelling with Emily in Peru. Back in London, Emily talked him into helping the nuns snatch women from the Albanians. He was enamoured with her. That was clear to see. This man was not interested in saving the women. He only craved confrontation and battle. But sometimes we use tools that do not fit our hands, and yet who's to say they're not good tools? The priest dragged hard on his cigarette, a wisp of regret flickering in his eyes, then just as quickly disappearing. What about the blood? You said she came back with blood on her clothes? McCarthy looked down at his hands and sighed. Something went wrong the third time they tried it. When Emily came back, she was screaming, all wild-eyed and hysterical. She was clutching this bag to her chest, blood all over her. The nuns hid her in the priest hole. They'd used it previously to shelter the escaped women, and it was comfortable, if a little damp. For the first few days, Emily refused to even come out. There was a new look in her eyes, and it took me a while to realize that I'd never seen her scared before. She left a week later without saying a word to anyone. We saw her less and less after that. The nuns curtailed their snatch work for the time being, battened down and hoped it would go away. Then the visits began. The Albanians, Carrigan's fingers were pressed tight against the stem of his pencil as he wrote down the information, all these missing blanks rushing in like mad, whirling flakes of snow.
They'd somehow worked out who was behind it. I have no idea how. 2 thugs came to the convent and asked to see Mother Angelica. They told her they only wanted Emily and the man who was with her that night. They didn't know their names, but they knew everything else. They came twice more, each visit with a new ultimatum to hand over the girl and Nigel. Mother Angelica held firm. They probably expected some spineless nun, and had no idea of the torture and suffering she had endured in South America. But she wasn't through with Emily. The next time Emily turned up, Mother Angelica took her off to the kitchen. I remember hearing them screaming and arguing and shouting over each other's words. Mother Angelica told her it was over, that she was no longer welcome in the convent, that if Emily didn't turn herself in to the police, the nuns would be forced to. Emily called her a coward, a fraud, and a fake, and then...
The door crashed open, spilling harsh white light into the room. 2 huge orderlies entered, ignoring Carrigan and Geneva, and made their way directly to Father McCarthy, their strides long and brisk and full of purpose. Carrigan rose from his chair and saw Roger Holden standing in the doorway. The 2 orderlies flanked McCarthy and, at a nod from Holden, grabbed him by both arms and lifted him out of the chair. Carrigan took a step forward, and one of the orderlies detached himself from the priest and moved towards him, arms tensed, an unspoken challenge in his eyes. "Put him down," Carrigan ordered, reaching for the baton on his belt. The orderly threw a short right, and Carrigan ducked and spun and grabbed the swinging fist in his own, twisting the man's arm behind his back in one quick move. The other orderly let go of Father McCarthy and was coming to his colleague's aid, fists squared and ready. "Wait, Norman," Holden said. "We don't need to do that, do we, Detective Inspector Carrigan?" Carrigan looked at the orderly, the ripple of muscles snaking down his arms, the funky smell of his fear sweat. He saw Geneva up and ready, the can of pepper spray clutched in her small fist. "After all," Holden continued, "you're trespassing. You used false pretenses to gain entry. You took information from my office without permission. You have broken several laws, all of which I'm sure ACC Quinn will be very interested to hear about." Carrigan took a step back, realising that Holden was right, and even if he somehow managed to overpower the orderlies, he would never be able to get McCarthy out of the building. He let go of the man's arm, catching his breath. The orderlies grabbed the priest and frog-marched him out of the room. McCarthy looked back at Carrigan once, then disappeared through the grey metal door. "Where the fuck are they taking him?" Carrigan said, moving closer to Holden, breathing the words into his face. Holden took a step back. "Don't you worry about that," he replied. "Father McCarthy has to prepare himself for a long flight tomorrow. He needs his rest." "A flight?" "He is being transferred to a small parish in the South Pacific, somewhere that needs a man like him. I'm sure he'll find it a very interesting posting. A lot of challenges." "You set me up, didn't you?" Carrigan said. "You left the room knowing we would... You even kept glancing in the direction of the filing cabinets every time I mentioned Father McCarthy." And then he stopped and leaned forward. "How long?" "How long what?" "How long have you known for? From the very beginning? Or did you stumble on what the nuns were up to in Peru by accident? That's the real reason you had them excommunicated, isn't it? Not over some book that no one would ever read." Holden resisted the temptation to take a further step back. "I don't know what you're talking about." Carrigan grabbed Holden's lapel and held him firm, cinching the material in his fists.
You suddenly have a very good reason for getting rid of the nuns." Holden pulled himself out of Carrigan's grip, smoothing down the lapels of his jacket and shaking his head. He looked at his watch and smiled. "You have only a few hours left to enjoy your last day as a policeman. I suggest you don't waste them here." Chapter 45. He'd never seen the ACC like this. Normally undemonstrative and calm, Quinn was pacing back and forth behind Branch's desk, the super nowhere to be seen, the grinding of Quinn's teeth the only sound in the room. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Quinn was pulling out Branch's chair, leaning on it, putting it back, his hands seemingly not under his control. "Sir?" Carrigan kept his face impassive, a sinking in his stomach, the way you know something before you know it. "I will not tolerate your continued disrespect to the church and the position it's put me in. I spoke to Roger Holden just now, and he's furious on the point of pressing charges against you. You're bloody lucky you're not suspended. What do you think you were doing, Carrigan?" Quinn's eyes shot up, cold and piercing. "No, don't answer. There is nothing you can say to make this better. You entered Burnham Monastery yesterday under false pretences and harassed a patient. I really thought someone with your background would be more discreet." "My background?" Carrigan repeated, lost words and conversations rattling through his head, that horrible sensation of things clicking into place. "You put me on this case because I'm a Catholic?" "Enough! Just listen to yourself, Carrigan. It's how it looks that matters. Now tell me, is the case wrapped up, or have you been wasting time again?" Carrigan took a deep breath and ran through what Father McCarthy had told them. Quinn's face was rigid and unblinking. "Whores?" Quinn said, shaking his head. "Nigel's murder makes sense now. His death, the torture, mutilation and prolongation of suffering, is consistent with a revenge killing by the Albanians. Duca was getting payback. The way he saw it, Nigel and Emily had stolen from him. Duca's men made 3 visits to the convent, demanding that the nuns hand over Emily and Nigel, and when the nuns refused, Duca sent someone to torch the place." Quinn sighed. "You have this gift of making something very complicated sound so simple, Carrigan. I wish it were so. If this really was Duca, you'll never tie him to it. You know that as well as I do." Carrigan was silent, the same thought circling his brain for the last few hours. "Maybe we can't tie him to the fire, but that doesn't mean we should just forget him. He's running a brothel on our patch, drugs, guns, God knows what else. Money is all he cares about, and that's where I want to hurt him. Raid his premises every other day. Station surveillance vans in plain sight outside his brothels. Make him give us the fire starter." Quinn shook his head and planted his hands deep in his pockets. "No. The last thing the Met needs right now is another harassment suit. You already have your culprit in the morgue." Carrigan wasn't sure he understood quite what Quinn was suggesting. "Nigel?" "The man was scum. I want to go live with this tomorrow lunchtime. You know what to say. Emily had broken up with Nigel and he wasn't too happy about it. He followed her to the convent, killed her, and set the fire to hide the evidence." "Nigel didn't do it," Carrigan said. "The man was trash, but he's just as much a victim of Duca as the nuns. I'm not going to let Duca get away with this." He said it with as much conviction as he could muster, but he could tell by the ACC's eyes that it wasn't enough. "I thought you'd say that, Carrigan. Which is why I called you in here to inform you that as of tomorrow, I'm transferring the case to D.I. Malone." Carrigan had been expecting this, but not so soon. He stopped,
took a deep breath, thought about what he was about to do, and said, "Perhaps it would be wise to think about that before you—"
"Are you threatening me?"
Quinn snapped. "Absolutely not." Carrigan eased forward on the chair, taking his time. "It's just that if D.I. Malone takes over, I'll have to hand him all my files, including the one detailing donors to the convent." Quinn stopped mid-stride and turned and stared at Carrigan. His hands gripped the back of the chair, the fingers turning white, his lips almost disappearing. "Donating money to a charity isn't a crime." Carrigan allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile. "No, you're correct. But it's how it looks that matters, right?" Quinn was breathing deeply, his fingers digging into the chair fabric, the rest of his body absolutely motionless. "You knew what they were doing, didn't you?" Carrigan stared into the ACC's eyes and saw no flicker of denial or surprise. "You knew, and you still gave them money." Quinn pulled out the seat and sat down heavily. He closed his eyes for a moment, eventually opening them to reveal small shrunk stones bereft of light. "Okay, Carrigan, what do you want?" "You want to be back on the case?" "I want a lot more than that." Quinn looked up and eyeballed him for a full minute before speaking. "Don't for a minute think I'll forget this, Carrigan." Geneva called out to Carrigan as he was leaving the building. She was sitting on a ledge outside the main gate, a cigarette clamped between her lips. She pulled off her earphones and crushed the butt under her shoe. "Problems with Quinn?" Carrigan walked over and stood beside her. She looked tired and frayed, her eyes sunk deep into their sockets. "Nah, he just wanted to tell me what a great job we're doing." It brought out a smile. He sat down on the ledge beside her, letting the adrenaline of the meeting course through his veins. "You done for the day?" She nodded. "Was going to watch one of those DVDs you lent me." She hesitated, her mouth slightly ajar. "Don't suppose you fancy joining me?" She looked down at her shoes and the still smoking butt beside them. "I'd love to," Carrigan replied, "but I have to go meet Donna." He noticed a flicker of something on Geneva's face, quickly subsumed. "I owe her Emily's story. She'd finally turned her life around, and the family needs to know that." Geneva didn't say anything for a few moments, her eyes searching his. "Are you sure it's because of the case you're going?" "Of course," he replied, but as soon as he said it, he knew he was partly lying and that it wasn't the only reason. He watched as Geneva walked away and disappeared under the grey overhang of the motorway, only a couple of crushed cigarette butts to remind him she'd even been here at all. Chapter 46. Donna was sitting at a corner table staring blankly at the snow, a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. When she saw Carrigan enter the cafe, her eyes softened and she brushed back a twist of stray hair as she got up. She was wearing a blue and white jumper and a brown skirt that curved and clung to her figure. They stood there for a long moment, not saying anything, their eyes locked together, and then Carrigan coughed and broke her stare. "Thanks for meeting me." Her smile was deep and warm. "I was so glad when I got your call," she said, and stepped aside to let him sit down. Their bodies brushed lightly against each other as he shuffled past her. They sat and sipped their coffees and watched the people stop and drink and make jokes with the baristas and wish them happy Christmas. He told her about Emily and what she'd been up to. She was trying to do good in her own way, and she was killed because of it. Donna wiped her eyes and smiled and took a sip of her coffee. Carrigan rested his palm on her elbow. "I'm sorry." Donna shuddered, a slight tremor that Carrigan could feel leaking through her arm.
Thank you for telling me about Emily. I know it's a small thing, but you don't know how much it means to me.
Her mouth was close to his, her breath sweet with coffee. She was a brave girl, Carrigan said, and before he could react, Donna leaned forward and planted a kiss on his cheek, her lips soft and warm and wet against his skin.
Thank you,
she whispered, leaning back, her face blushing.
You know, that day by the pond, that was my only good day since...
I know. Carrigan smiled softly, got up, and walked away. He waited for the bus, but was too impatient to stand around, so he started walking, trying to burn off the excess energy in the gathering storm. He could barely see a few feet in front of him, but he didn't mind, enjoying the sting and melt of the snow against his face, and thinking about Donna's last words, the residual heat of her kiss on his cheek. He didn't notice the SUV stopping 50 feet ahead of him, nor see the man get out. He looked down at the man's hands, and all thoughts of Donna's long hair and shy smile were instantly erased. The gun was pointing at his stomach, and Victor's eyes were hard and sharp.
Get in.
Carrigan stood frozen.
I said get the fuck in.
Victor used the gun to gesture to the passenger seat. Carrigan saw that it had been pushed back to its limit. He felt the barrel press up against his flesh, and he leaned in and was about to sit down when Victor shouted,
On the floor!
He crouched down on his knees in the scant space of the SUV's footwell, knowing that this was the crucial moment. Once they were both in the car, his chances of escape were virtually zero. His only opportunity would be when Victor made his way across to the driver's side. Carrigan steadied himself and rehearsed how he would do it. Wait until the Albanian sat down, when his body and aim were out of line. He started a deep breathing cycle to calm his heart and still his hands. Victor looked down into the car, smiled as if he had just read Carrigan's mind, and smashed the butt of the gun against his head. Chapter 47. The feel of the gritted road beneath him, the swelling pressure in his head, the smell of crushed cigarettes and cracked leather. Carrigan opened his eyes and looked around. He was crouched in the footwell, squeezed into a space too small for a man half his size. His wrists had been secured with a plastic snap tie, his fingers already numb and swollen. "Victor?" The man didn't flinch or react to his own name. The effort to speak caused a new wave of nausea to rise through Carrigan's throat, and he fought hard against the weight of his own body as it tried to sink back into blackness. The dark, smeared sky stretched above him. He could see individual snowflakes smash against the passenger window and dissolve like tears. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" Victor turned towards him for a split second and hissed, "Shut up!" Carrigan tried to ignore the pain creeping up his legs. His knees were almost touching his chin, and the enforced position was starting to pull at muscles he never knew existed, torquing his spine and chest, making each breath something to be gasped and fought for. He could taste his own blood in his mouth. He thought of what had been done to Nigel, and wondered if they had a special place for that sort of work, and if that was where Victor was taking him. The sudden pull of gravity told him they were ascending a motorway ramp. A bitter taste filled his mouth as he realised they must be heading out of London. The ramp, most probably the M40, scrolling out of the darkened west. He tried to identify the buildings as their roofs passed in a blur through the passenger window, but they were only flashes in the night, dim and unrecognisable. The road levelled and their speed picked up. Carrigan felt the sour taste of vomit in his throat and swallowed it back down. His heart was hammering away, a deep rumble through his chest. He remembered the feel of Donna's kiss on his cheek, the sadness weighing down her eyes, the way he'd walked into Victor's trap. "The police will be following you," he said, but he knew they wouldn't even realize he was missing until morning.
"Shut up,"
the man repeated. The fact that Victor was unconcerned about showing his face made Carrigan uneasy. He remembered D.I. Bird's warnings about what Duca and the Albanians were capable of, and that snowy morning in the pub, the smell of beer and damp wood and old men seemed like a lifetime away. The car began to decelerate, a deepening hum as Victor spun the wheel, and they were suddenly bumping along an unpaved track, the darkness swallowing everything. Victor stopped the car, looked down at Carrigan, and gestured with the gun. "Get out slowly," the Albanian said. "Don't do anything stupid," he added. "Don't make me have to shoot you." Carrigan wondered if this was the moment, if this was to be his last and only chance. He uncurled slowly and stepped out of the car. He lost his footing on the soft ground, expecting concrete, not earth, and righted himself just in time, about to make his move, when he felt the cold kiss of the gun against his head, and he didn't know how Victor had got out of the car and across so quickly.
"Over there."
Victor pointed towards a dark form at the edge of their vision. Carrigan began walking towards it, the man at his back, the snow falling softly on his face. They were in an allotment in the middle of a large field. Carrigan could see the dividing fences and square lots to either side. He saw the shed they were heading towards, a rickety wooden structure pitched at the end of the allotment. He felt the snow melt through his shoes and soak his feet, the chill wind cutting through his clothes. He walked slowly, grudgingly, knowing he'd been wrong, and that the chance had come and gone, and now there was only him, the man, the gun, and the dark interior of the shed. Carrigan thought back to Father McCarthy's words, how things had gone wrong, the blood on Emily's clothes.
"These nuns and this girl, you were right. They were helping women who'd escaped. But that was not enough for them. They decided to take it a step further. Emily and her friend jumped my men twice and took the girls from them. We started using two-man teams. Emily and her accomplice appeared outside one of our properties on Old Street. They surrounded my men and demanded they release the girl. As you can imagine, my men refused. Then this Emily of yours, from nowhere, she leaps forward and suddenly she has this knife in her hand, this big kitchen knife, and she stabs my man in the stomach. Not once, but several times.
"How'd you know this?" Carrigan said, feeling his stomach drop.
"I was there. I saw my friend get stabbed, holding his stomach, his guts pouring out, and Emily didn't stop. Her mouth was open and she was grinning. Her eyes were blazing as she plunged the knife in again and again. Her accomplice held me. The woman ran off, but Emily wouldn't stop until her friend had to grab her, wrestle the knife away, and slap her face to calm her down. Bratislav crashed to the ground. Emily picked up the bag he was carrying, then ran back to the van. I stood there and watched my friend die because of her."
"Jesus."
"Yes, this is your innocent little victim. This is the kind of woman she was. I do not get scared of much, but I was scared of her. She was crazy. She loved it. You should have seen her face."
"The bag? What was in the bag?"
"Cocaine,"
Victor replied.
"For the customers. Bratislav was dropping off the brothel's weekly supply."
"You're not exactly convincing me of your innocence," Carrigan said, the images whirling through his brain, half-remembered conversations with the priest and the Maxtids. "Everything you've told me just gives you more reason to have wanted her dead. If you're so innocent, what were you doing in the ruins of the convent the night you attacked me?" Victor shrugged.
Duca had us watching the convent. He wanted to know what was happening, what the police were doing, whether there was anything there that could lead back to us. We saw you that night. We didn't know who you were. It was too late for an official visit, and you were alone. We thought you might be Nigel, the man who'd helped Emily.
You're digging yourself a deeper hole as we speak.
Wrong, my friend. You think we're stupid? You think we're that stupid? We wanted the girl, this Emily, and we wanted the man with her. But the nuns were not our concern.
The nuns were helping shelter your women. The Albanian laughed.
Girls are cheap, detective. In fact, you could say they are less than cheap. They are free. So what if a few escape? This is the price of business. It is much easier for us to get 10 new girls than chase down one escaped whore.
But you would want to teach them a lesson. Isn't that how you work? You want to teach the nuns a lesson so that others don't get the same idea.
Believe me, if we had wanted to teach them a lesson, you would know about it. We would not give them the easy option of dying in flames. We would make their deaths long and drawn out, and we would leave much evidence of suffering on their bodies.
Like you did with Nigel.
He was involved in the killing of one of our men. He got exactly what he deserved. But to burn down a convent, it would be a stupid business decision, put the spotlight on us and bring us unwelcome attention. We went and talked with the nuns. We told them we knew what they were doing, but that we were prepared to forget that. We talked to the old one, the head nun, and we told her what Emily had done. I thought we would have to convince her of the truth of this, but she needed no convincing. I could see that she had feared exactly such a thing, yet she refused to give up the girl. We visited 3 times, but she wouldn't budge. We knew it didn't matter. We have long memories and a lot of patience. We would wait. Emily would show herself. Then we would take back what we were owed.
You expect me to believe that?
I can see that you already do, Victor said. Whoever set the fire stole Emily from us. She belonged to Duca. If we find this person before you do, I can promise you he won't be bringing his lawyer with him.
Why all the charade of kidnapping me and bringing me here?
If someone sees me with you, detective, then I am dead, and my family back home are dead. It is that simple.
Then why do it? Carrigan asked. Why tell me all this?
Because we are businessmen, and your crusade is bad for our business.
Bullshit. You wouldn't take such a risk if that were true. Kidnapping a police officer is much worse for business than a few raids. Carrigan stopped. He thought about how Victor had known about the upcoming raids. A stray sentence Bird had said a couple of days ago. The risk the Albanian was taking being here. And then he knew. You're not really one of them, are you? You're working with Bird. That's why you know about the raids. Victor looked at him without blinking.
Repeat those words ever again, and I will find you, and I will kill you. Understand?
Carrigan smiled. I understand. Victor walked away, leaving himself unprotected, the gun hanging loosely at his side. As he opened the door, he turned back towards Carrigan.
You want to know what happened that night? Then I suggest you think about what Nigel was trying to tell you.
He nodded once, then shut the door behind him. Carrigan didn't get up. He sat and tried not to think about what Victor had said, because if Victor and Duca weren't behind the fire, then he'd been wrong all along. Chapter 48. The next morning, he dismissed the entire team. He pulled down the action sheets, scrawled lists and minutely delineated graphs from the walls, and shut down the incident room. He sent the Holmes analysts away and rotated the uniforms back to regular duty. He told everyone to go home and enjoy their Christmas holidays. He'd explained his reasons, and they'd been surprised, some even outraged, but Carrigan could see that they all accepted it with the same snap of logic he had. There were stunned looks, evident relief, and many questions, but Carrigan shut himself off in his office, the door for once closed. The snow was falling thickly outside, obscuring the buildings and greater city beyond, and he spent the rest of the morning going through the case files again, trying to find any way he could be wrong, any other answer that would fit the facts, any other option but this. He focused on the interview statements, reading and rereading each phrase and sentence, then listening to the recordings, hoping to isolate any peculiarity of intonation or tone that would give lie to the printed word. But everything he read and heard only made him more certain. Geneva was knocking on the door. The sound registered, but only obscurely, as yet another minor distraction, a faint tap at the edge of consciousness. He looked up and saw her standing halfway into his office, tall black boots reaching almost to her knees. She took out her earplugs and looped them around her index finger, a fluent and practised gesture that nonetheless carried a hint of irritation about it. "Can you please explain to me what's going on?" Her voice was sharp and fierce. "We've been wrong from the start," Carrigan replied, thinking back to last night, the smell of wet soil and ice, the way his body had shaken uncontrollably for a long time after Victor had left. He walked out of the shed and trudged through the snow-bound fields until he'd reached the motorway. He'd walked a further mile before he found a service station. Back home, he'd paced the rooms of his flat, unable to sleep, to stop the incessant flickering of his eyelids, thinking about what Victor had said, running it through his head, trying to find a fault or crack that would split apart the man's story. But no matter how hard he tried, how many ways he looked at it, he could not. As dawn filtered through the gaps in his curtains, he'd slowly and unwillingly come to the realization that the case had been over before it had even begun. "You're shutting down the investigation." Geneva was looking at him, perplexed and a little piqued. She'd forgotten to turn off her iPod, and he could hear a faint hiss coming from her top pocket. She listened intently, didn't say a word, didn't blink, and bit down on her lip as he told her Victor's story. "Emily killed someone." She couldn't hide the tremble of disappointment in her voice, a muzzy deflation of pitch dragging down each vowel. "Jesus Christ." Carrigan closed his eyes and shrugged. "I've been going through it all night, running the different scenarios, trying to see where we went wrong. All morning I've been rereading the witness statements and forensic results, going over them so many times I could recite you the exact height and weight of each nun, along with their favourite saints." He stopped, took a sip of coffee. "Victor's story is the only explanation that makes sense of what we know." She hadn't heard him, or was pretending not to, her body tilted forward, a hard, bright gleam in her eyes. "What else is he going to say?" Her voice trembled. "You need to report this, and then we can get a warrant for Victor and arrest him and find out what the fuck he has to do with the fire." He could see the rushing excitement in her face, the scent of prey, and felt bad for deflating it. "I'm not going to report it." She glared at him, a strange rumbling in her eyes. "You have to." "Like you reported the other night." She stopped her pacing and frowned.
That's not fair. No, you're right, it wasn't. Carrigan admitted. But I'm not reporting it. Geneva drummed her fingers against her thigh. You're not telling me something. I can tell by the way you won't look at me. He thought about it, had been thinking about it all night. Victor's not who we think he is. Who the fuck is he? Santa Claus? He ignored her comment. Victor's undercover, working for or with Bird. He's been in Duca's organisation for 3 years. We nearly blew his cover. He told me they had nothing to do with the fire, and at first I didn't believe him either. But when I subtracted Duca from the equation, everything suddenly fell into place. Geneva shook her head. You're going to have to do a better job of convincing me than that. Think about what Father McCarthy said. Carrigan felt a delayed rush of energy exploding in his chest. It was always like this when she challenged him, when he had to put his own inchoate thoughts and suppositions into the thin bindings of language, and he loved to see her eyes spark as she made the connections. McCarthy said that the third time Emily tried to rescue one of the women, something went wrong, and she came back with blood on her clothes. And we know the visits from Duca's men started right after that. He picked up Emily's arrest sheet and glanced at it. That first contact he'd had with her, the snarled look she'd hurled at the camera, the black tunnel of her gaze. Besides, the Albanians would have wanted Emily alive. They'd want her to suffer and to make an example of her. An anonymous body found in a possibly accidental fire wouldn't serve their purposes. Geneva sat down, pulled out her cigarettes, looked at the packet, then put them back, realising that everything she knew about the case was wrong. She tried to fight the rush of logic and reasons pouring in from all directions, but it was hopeless. She could feel things clicking, an almost physical sensation of interlocked threads. The loose ends and anomalies suddenly resolving themselves. Yet there was something about it that felt too neat, that felt wrong, and she couldn't figure out what it was. If Duca didn't set the fire, then who did? Carrigan looked down at the table and didn't reply. This was the part he'd been dreading. He knew that once he uttered the words, there would be no going back. He rubbed his fingers through his beard, noticing he'd forgotten to trim it recently, and leaned forward. All along, we've been thinking that the fire had something to do with the nuns' activities in Peru. The more we looked into it, the more certain we became, the more the clues pointed in that direction. We got swept away by the pull of narrative. It makes sense, so it must be true. We focused too narrowly and ignored the other possibilities. He knew it was his fault. He was to blame, no one else. The case had been his, and he'd led them all down the wrong path. He stood up, the failure rushing hot and tight in his throat, and turned to the whiteboard. One by one, he peeled off the photos of Victor, Duca, Eagleneck, Father McCarthy, and Jeff Shorter. Then he took several steps back. The board looked bare and stark. Geneva stared at Carrigan, then at the whiteboard. She looked down at the floor, then out the window at the snow-dazzled sky. She didn't want to say it, but she did. You're not seriously suggesting. She stared at the whiteboard again, then at Carrigan. There has to be another explanation. She looked at the one face left pinned up on the board as she tried to fight the thoughts tumbling through her head. Emily, she finally said, her voice pinched and flat and disbelieving. Emily Maxted set the fire. Carrigan nodded almost imperceptibly. Put yourself in her shoes. He pulled out a sheet of paper so cross-hatched with scribbles and jottings it looked an impenetrable slab of black. Emily is in major trouble, easily the worst of her life. She's killed someone,
and now the Albanians are looking for her. She knows they do not forget, that they will hunt her down for however long it takes. She goes to the nuns, perhaps seeking sanctuary, but they turn against her. They're threatening to go to the police and report the murder if she doesn't hand herself in first. She is in an impossible position. On one side, there's the prospect of torture and a very bad death. On the other, a life sentence for murder. Geneva shook her head vigorously, as if trying to rid herself of some buzzing insect. "You think she committed suicide?" "No, I don't," he replied. "Remember how Mother Angelica told her she wasn't welcome anymore? Maybe one of the nuns spotted her and there was an altercation. Maybe the pricket stand got knocked about in the struggle. Then how did she end up in the confession booth?" "I don't know," Carrigan admitted. "It's likely we'll never know what exactly went down that night." He glanced over at the photo of Emily that Donna had taken a few weeks ago. "What are you going to do now?" Geneva asked. "I'm going to pack up the files, put them in a box and go to Quinn with this. Tell him we've closed the case and that Emily set the fire. He won't like it, but that's the way it is. Then I'm going to drive over to the Maxteds and tell them before they find out about it in the press." "Some Christmas," Geneva said. And Carrigan saw her eyes crumple and fall, the dragon slant of her mouth, 100 emotions whirling through her skull. "Some Christmas, all right." He started putting the cascading mountain of papers, interview transcripts, statements and photocopied reports back into the large box file at his feet after she'd gone. His movements were slow and grudging, his head aching with the fatigue of too many days and too little sleep. They had looked for complexity and collusion, but in the end there were only the actions of one damaged individual who'd kept closing doors on herself until there was only one door left. In that sense, it had turned out well for everyone, Carrigan thought sourly. Holden and the bishop would be happy that the nuns' activities in Peru remained a secret. Quinn would be pleased that the solution hadn't opened up an entire can of worms containing Albanian people smugglers and young girls enslaved and raped in the heart of London. No one wanted to read about that in their Christmas papers, and no one would. But the girls would still be sold, the brothels running at full capacity over the holiday season, new recruits coming in all the time, a quivering legion of the silent and the damned. Carrigan picked up some more sheets of paper and placed them in the long cardboard box, and it felt as if he were filling a grave. There was always something bittersweet about closing a case, but this time it was different. He didn't feel happy, satisfied, or even relieved. He drained the last of his coffee and cleared the last of the papers. He stared again at the photos of the fire, the dining room, bodies curled up like children, dripping walls and cracked statues, the confession booth's dark interior, the collapsed floors and smouldering crucifixes. Then he put them away, glad he wouldn't ever have to look at them again. There would only be a skeleton crew operating from the station over the next few days. The city hushed in snow and festivity, and then it would start up all over again, the arguments and stabbings and pub fights and petty murders and phone calls waking him in the middle of the night. He thought about Geneva and how he'd need to have a serious chat with her in the new year, sort out the problem before it was too late. But, in spite of all that, he'd been impressed by her yet again. Her rugged determination and needle-sharp instincts, the way she could see clear through his blind spots. He put the lid on the case box, ready for it to be shipped to some mouldy basement. He thought of his own flat, the dark, silent rooms and boxes of memories packed away in the attic, the squandered years sequestered behind cardboard and cobwebs. When he was finished, he longed for a cigarette, but those days were gone. He emailed his report to Branch and Quinn, then got up and faced the whiteboard. There was only one photo left, and he gently peeled it off, the snap that Donna had taken of her sister 2 weeks before the fire. He stared at Emily's face, those deep, piercing eyes and slanted mouth, and then he noticed something in the bottom right-hand corner of the photo, and his breath stopped. He stared at it for a long moment, everything else forgotten. A stray conversation echoed through his head. He strained to hear the words and understand their significance. Time seemed to contract and slow. Sentences ran jumbled through his brain, inflections and facts, things that didn't mean much at the time, now magnified to disproportionate size. His mouth felt dry, his hands slick and clammy. He knelt down and started taking the files back out of the box, throwing them onto the floor, going through the reports and statements until he found what he was looking for. He pulled out the printed transcript of Jeff Shorter's interview and started reading it again. Halfway through, he came upon that suddenly remembered phrase, and he stopped, and his whole body shook as he realized what it meant. For a moment, it seemed he couldn't move, and then he put the report down and pulled out the photos of the burnt-out convent. He flicked through them until he got to the one he wanted. He stared at it and couldn't believe he hadn't noticed it before. But he had to be sure, absolutely sure. He flung open his desk drawers, pulling them all the way out and upturning them onto the tabletop. He started going through months of accumulated junk, stray staples, post-it notes, coffee loyalty cards, half-filled forms and bus tickets, flinging everything onto the floor, and he was getting more desperate and frenetic as he neared the bottom, and then he saw it. Lodged between the pages of a week-old newspaper. He reached for it, but pulled his hand away just in time and snapped on a pair of gloves from the nearby dispenser, realizing how his impatience had nearly ruined everything. He picked it up, placed it carefully in an evidence bag, and called the lab. Chapter 49. He texted Geneva early on Christmas Day. He'd gone straight home from the station the previous night and hadn't slept or eaten or done much of anything until the lab had called back. When the first faint light of Christmas morning lit up the motorway ramp outside his flat, he knew it couldn't wait. He called Karen and apologised for having to cancel Christmas dinner. There was a long silence, and then she said she understood, and he knew she did. He picked Geneva up from her mother's house. She was dressed in clothes he'd never seen her in before, sedate and somehow formal, and it took him a moment to recognise her. An older woman was leaning out the front door, staring in his direction. "My mom wanted to come out and give you hell," Geneva said, but Carrigan could tell she was only half as pissed off as she was pretending to be. The city was empty, the shops closed, the roads stripped of the constant honk and whine of traffic. As they headed north through the abandoned streets and holiday hush, they could feel the muted sense of anticipation leaking from every Christmas tree-lit window. Eager young faces pressed against the glass, watching the skies, their features distorted like stockinged bank robbers. It had been snowing for 11 days, but it hadn't yet snowed today. "This is all very nice," Geneva said, "but where exactly are we going?" "It's Christmas," Carrigan replied, "and I have one good deed left to do." She knew there would be no point pressing him further, and so she sipped her coffee and stared out of the window, recognising streets and junctions they'd passed through less than a week ago, the large houses rising out of the mist like the prows of doomed ships, the high street gloomy and shuttered, the sprawling expanse of heath blanketing them on both sides. "I feel like such an idiot." Carrigan shook his head. 2 days ago, I was telling them their daughter died trying to do something good. The maid opened the door and led them into the dining room. The scene looked as if nothing had changed from a few days ago, as if it were a painting slowly drying in its frame. What was left of the Maxted family was gathered around the table in the middle of Christmas lunch. Miles Maxted sat at one end, Lillian at the other, Donna, wearing a red dress, was stranded in the yawning gap between them. The Maxteds hadn't started on their main course, the food still steaming from the oven, the maid laying out the final pieces, then silently taking her place in the corner of the room. Lillian was twirling a lock of hair in her fingers and didn't even notice their arrival, but Donna looked up, and her eyes grew wide and soft as she recognised Carrigan. Geneva caught the look, the longing in it, and felt a hot rush of something she couldn't quite name.
"What do we owe this pleasure to?"
Miles Maxted's voice was already thick with alcohol. "I'm sorry to intrude like this," Carrigan said quietly, "but something's come up." Carrigan kept his face blank as he took his seat. The food smelt wonderful, but it was obvious no one was eating. Their plates full, contents untouched, the cutlery still perfectly arrayed on either side. "The investigation into the fire at the convent is about to be officially closed. There's going to be a press conference tonight, but I thought it best you hear it from me first." Miles Maxted looked up.
"Just tell us what you have to tell us, and leave us in peace."
"Remember how I said that Emily was working with the nuns, and that she was killed by the Albanians because of this?" "You caught them?" Donna asked breathlessly. Carrigan shook his head. "I was wrong," he said. "The Albanians were involved in all this, but not in the way we thought. They didn't set the fire." "Then who did?" Donna asked. Carrigan took a deep breath. "I hate to be the one to say this, but we now believe Emily set the fire herself." He watched the reaction on Miles Maxted's face, the sudden darkening in the man's eyes, the twitch that made his lips snap against one another.
"What on earth would she do that for?"
Carrigan had put the last details into place as he'd sat waiting for Geneva that morning. "We don't know for sure. It could have been an accident. Emily was helping the nuns shelter escaped sex slaves, as I told Donna, but since then we found out that Emily had taken it a step further." He ran through what Victor had told him about that fateful night. Emily killed one of the men in the ensuing struggle, stabbing him. "Oh my God!" Donna blurted, her face white as a candle. "No! No!" she kept repeating to herself. "Emily would never—" "I'm afraid she did," Carrigan replied. "But if it's any consolation, the man she killed was probably trying to do the same to her." He watched Miles taking this in, eyes blinking rapidly. Carrigan could see that however much he didn't want to believe it, his heart was pulling him in the opposite direction. Donna was quietly sobbing, and she reached over and took her mother's hand as Carrigan continued. "The Albanians didn't take kindly to the murder of one of their own. They obviously didn't go to the police either." Carrigan explained about the visits to the convent and demands to hand over Emily. "Oh, God! Poor Emily!" Donna said, her arms dropping to her sides and hanging there uselessly like a rag doll's. Carrigan stared at her, the beauty he'd noticed the first day not diminished, but somehow ennobled by her grief. "But you see, I have this annoying thing where I can't sleep very well when I'm on a case, and I kept thinking about this, thinking about Emily, what we knew about her, pacing my room, making myself coffee after coffee, but no matter how I looked at it, it just didn't make sense." He turned to see Geneva's eyes wide and alert, her gaze focused exclusively on him, a slight rebuke in the tilt of her head. Emily was a survivor. Everything we know about her tells us this. So, I had another coffee and looked out the window and knew that someone who'd defend herself so aggressively against one of Duca's gangland thugs would never give in so easily. And it kept bugging me. Why didn't she run away? Why didn't she simply disappear? From her years in the protest movement, she would have known a lot of safe houses and hiding places, a lot of comrades who would ask no questions and gladly help her vanish. Carrigan stopped pacing the room and turned towards the table. The next morning, it was still there. In fact, the nagging feeling had got stronger. But there was nothing I could do about it, and so I started to clear the incident room, taking the photos off the wall, and as I peeled off Emily's picture, the one that Donna took, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, and that's when I knew.
"What on earth are you talking about?"
Miles Maxted said. When I looked closely at the photo, I realised Emily couldn't have been the 11th victim. He paused, watching everyone's expressions freeze and flicker. Geneva shooting him a dark, stricken look that spoke of deep frustration and backhanded betrayal. And then I remembered something. It was barely there, but I could sense it, buried under layers of useless information. I pulled up the transcript of the interview we did with Emily's boyfriend, Jeff Shorter, because I was sure he'd said something that we'd not taken in at the time. I scanned through the transcript and found it, but I had to be sure. Carrigan continued, and I knew one way I could be certain. I was only worried I might have thrown it away, but it was there in my desk. The small white card that Donna gave me last week. I had the lab look at it, and they managed to get a usable print from it.
But why on earth would you do that?
Miles protested, and, despite all the bluster and front, Carrigan could see he was upset. We had Emily's fingerprints on file from her arrest. We couldn't compare them to those belonging to the body of the 11th victim because the skin had been too badly burned. But I did a comparison between Emily's arrest record and the print found on the piece of paper Donna gave me. They were the same.
"I don't understand,"
Miles said. "No, neither did I," Carrigan replied. So I got on the phone to someone at King's College who's an expert on these things, and he told me something very interesting. Apparently, twins have identical DNA, but not identical fingerprints. Your fingerprints are shaped by what you do, how you use your hands during the formative years of childhood. I guess you never knew that, did you? Emily. Chapter 50.
"You need to get out of my house right now, Inspector."
Miles Maxted shot up, his chair flying back, his face tight and flushed, eyelids fluttering like maddened butterflies.
"I can see what you're trying to do, and I won't allow it."
"I'm afraid I can't do that. Please calm down, Mr. Maxted. I haven't finished yet."
"How dare you!"
"Sit down, Mr. Maxted, and I promise I'll explain it to you, or perhaps—" Carrigan looked across the table. "Perhaps Emily can explain it better than I can."
"You don't know what you're talking about, Jack."
Her voice sent a shiver down his spine, coarse and rough, the way she used his name like an insult hurled in a fit of anger. It was a voice he hadn't heard before. Emily's voice. He forced himself to look at her, but it was a totally different woman who was now looking back at him. "It won't be hard to prove. We can take your fingerprints right now and settle this." She held his stare and said nothing. "What on earth happened to you?" Carrigan said, and Geneva could hear the concern and mystification in his voice. "You seem to have turned your life around, to have started doing something good." Emily looked at her parents, but they refused to meet her stare. She turned towards Carrigan.
"It wasn't supposed to happen like this."
"It never is," he replied, thinking of all the times he'd heard that line. "What was Donna doing in the convent the night of the fire?"
"She followed me there.
I told her to stay at home and wait for me, but she didn't." Emily shook her head and stared down at the table.
"I was going to return the cocaine. I don't even know why I took it that night.
Everything was so crazy. I knew it wouldn't get the Albanians off my back, but I thought it might be a useful bargaining tool, and I didn't want the nuns to find it. Donna insisted she come with me.
She followed me there.
I told her to stay at home and wait for me, but she didn't. Emily shook her head and stared down at the table. I was going to return the cocaine. I don't even know why I took it that night. Everything was so crazy. I knew it wouldn't get the Albanians off my back, but I thought it might be a useful bargaining tool, and I didn't want the nuns to find it. Donna insisted she come with me. I tried arguing with her, but it was no use. She kept scratching her forearm and taking shallow, quick breaths, trying to catch her parents' eyes. Nigel was waiting for us at the convent. I talked to him the night before, told him that if we used the cocaine as a bargaining chip, the Albanians might let us go. He laughed and said I was nuts. He wanted us to sell the coke and use the money to get out of the country before the Albanians found us. I didn't expect him to turn up at the convent. He was halfway out of his head, all amped up on speed and fear and adrenaline. He told me the nuns wouldn't be disturbing us. He'd made sure of that by locking the door. He said the cocaine would help us start a new life. I knew any life I began with him would end up exactly the way this one had. We argued and screamed at each other. I had the bag in my hand and I swung it at his head. The bag caught the candles and pricket stand as I threw it. Nigel staggered backwards. I started to run, but he caught me and pinned me up against the wall and started to strangle me. I heard Donna scream as she jumped him. He turned and punched her in the face, and she spun and fell forward and hit her head on the side of the pricket stand as she crashed to the floor. She didn't make a sound. Nigel started coming for me again, and then he stopped. He was staring wide-eyed at the niche behind me. I turned and saw that the candles had ignited the drapes. Big shooting flames ran up the walls and were spreading across the ceiling. Nigel took one last look, laughed, and ran out through the back window and into the garden. Emily shook, her entire body crumpling as she continued. I went to where Donna was lying. There was blood circling her head. I couldn't find her pulse. The flames were spreading across the room. I tried lifting her, tried slapping her face to wake her up, but there was no reaction. I tried dragging her, but the flames were all around us now. There was nothing I could do. If I hadn't left that moment, the fire would have got me too. And as you knelt there and saw Donna, you realised how convenient this would be, Carrigan said, his voice calm and reassuring, belying the words coming from his mouth. Emily shook her head. It wasn't like that. There was nothing I could do. Donna was dead. She was alive, Carrigan said. She woke up. What? All the blood drained from Emily's face. She came to before the fire reached her. She crawled into the confession booth thinking she'd be safe there. She was burned alive inside, screaming and flailing and ripping her fingernails against the hissing metal, Carrigan explained. It's my fault. I should have seen it earlier. Her long nails scratched and tore at the interior of the booth as she was burning to death. But you, Emily, you bite your nails. They wouldn't have made a mark. Jeff Shorter mentioned in his interview that it was a bad habit of yours, and it reminded me of something I heard a few days ago, how there are no hidden meanings, only actions and their consequences. Emily's hand slid under the table, but her face told Carrigan all he needed to know. Why didn't you tell us? Lillian's voice was cold and dismissive, the same tone Carrigan had heard her use with the maid. A single tear ran down Emily's cheek. I was going to, I swear. But then you were so nice to me when you thought I was Donna, and I didn't want that to change. I never felt that from you or Dad. I knew that Donna's death would break your heart, and despite the way you'd always treated me, I couldn't bear to do that to you. I knew you'd far prefer it if it was me who was dead. She looked at both parents, but neither said a word nor denied her accusations.
I just wanted you to love me like you did her.
Emily's arms reached across the table into empty space.
I thought if I pretended to be her, if I said the things she said and did the things she did, then maybe I would grow to be a bit more like her. I hope...
Emily stopped and looked up as Miles and Lillian Maxted rose from their seats.
Please. Mum? Dad?
Lillian followed her husband out of the room. Emily watched them disappear down the dark hallway. She kept staring long after they'd gone, and continued to do so as Carrigan handcuffed her and led her outside to the waiting police car. He walked through the snow and howling wind until his feet were numb, and he kept walking, oblivious to direction or purpose, a solitary man trudging through the deserted city. And as he walked, he turned his face away from the lighted windows, silhouetted Christmas trees and happy screams of children opening their presents. He pulled up his collar and buttoned his jacket as the wind came careening down the long empty street. The temperature had suddenly dropped, and he could feel his wrist, broken 5 years ago in a bar fight, begin to throb and ache with the memory of that night. He wanted the wind to rip through his skull and blow everything away. All the years and nights and days, the dreams and disappointments, memories and missed chances. But most of all, he wanted to forget this case and all its dark and twisted layers. He walked as if the very act of walking could shake off the last 2 weeks as easily as it did the snow gathered in the folds of his raincoat. He walked in ever-decreasing circles, traversing the shuttered shops and barren canals, the darkened office buildings and silent motorways, losing all track of time and space as the snow began to fall on Christmas Day, until he realised he was back at the station. And that's when he saw her. She was sitting on a ledge, smoking a cigarette. The snow had woven ribbons of white through her hair, and, unaware that he was there, she was swaying silently to the music, the twirled straps of her earphones framing her neck. Carrigan felt a rush of heat and memory flood his chest, and quickened his step. That was 11 Days, by Stav Sherez, read by David Thorpe.